Hey friends, this is our Dean's fandom of fiction. In today's special we are gonna see Dean was normal policeman, something unbelievable happened with him. Sorry for disturbance, you skipped 20 seconds from here. Dean Winchester walked past the same diner every day on his way to work. He lived 2 blocks from the precinct. The diner stood on the corner of 5th and Michigan Avenue, and the police station was on the corner of 4th and Michigan. Every morning he'd walk past the windows to see the same situation. A couple guys from the station were in there, tormenting the poor guy that ran it. He shook his head in disbelief as he saw one. His lieutenant, Zachariah, grabbed the waiter's arm as he walked past. It jerked the waiter to a standstill, and Zachariah said something to him before roughly letting him go. Dean sighed in disapproval and kept walking. He loved his job as a detective, but there were still a bunch of people on the force that remembered the old days and liked them. Dean wasn't a stickler for rules, but he didn't see the amusement in hurting an innocent person on purpose. He supposed he'd already witnessed and had been the victim of mistreatment in the past. It came with the territory of being a gay cop. He'd been hazed brutally at the academy, but had still managed to graduate with flying colors and be promoted to plainclothes detective in record time. As he passed the second set of windows, he looked in again and saw the unfortunate waiter walk past the booth full of Dean's so-called workmates and see Uriel, the big African-American who partnered with Crowley, the third in their group, slap the waiter on the butt. Dean knew from experience that Uriel hit hard, and the fact was made abundantly clear when the blow caused the waiter to fall to his hands and knees. Dean stopped in his tracks, debating his next move, when he saw Uriel pull the waiter back on his feet with a huge meaty hand wrapped around the waiter's slim upper arm. His decision was made. He stalked back to the front door and opened it, the bell ringing. The group of cops and the waiter were the only people in the diner, and they all turned to see him walk in. "Hey Winchester, what the hell are you doing here?" Zachariah asked, leaning back in the booth and taking a sip of his coffee, to prove he was completely at ease in the situation. "You don't come in here," Uriel stated, his hand still holding the waiter's arm. "If he did, you'd be in trouble," he added to the waiter. Dean took that moment to fully study the waiter in Uriel's grasp. He was shorter than Dean and much slighter. His dark hair was in an unruly mess, and, despite the fact that one was encircled in a fresh bruise, his eyes almost took Dean's breath away. They were the bluest eyes Dean had ever seen. And right now they were staring at him, a mixture of emotions swirling in their depths: pain, anger, fear, and hope. "Uriel, why don't you let him go?" Dean asked calmly, walking up so that he stood opposite the waiter next to Uriel's booth. "Why, you want him all for yourself?" Crowley cooed sarcastically. "Shut your hole, Crowley." "Uriel, let the man go," Dean said, forcing as much authority into his voice as possible. Zachariah drained his coffee cup and, instead of placing it back on the saucer, he dropped it on the floor, the sound of the cup breaking making the waiter flinch. "Let's get out of here, boys. I think Winchester wants some alone time with our favorite waiter," he said. Crowley and Zachariah got out from their side of the bench, and Uriel jerked the waiter's arm out of his grip and stood up too. The three of them walked past Dean. Zachariah didn't even look at him. Crowley glared at him, and Uriel brushed past him. But at the ring of the bell at the door, they were gone. Dean turned back to the waiter who was watching them walk past the windows, rubbing his arm where Uriel had grabbed him. "Are you all right?" Dean asked softly. The waiter looked up at him and quickly started to clean up the mess the 3 men had left him. "I'm fine," he replied, in almost a whisper. Dean crouched down and started picking up the pieces of the broken coffee cup and placing them carefully in his hand. "Please, I'll do that," the waiter said, hurrying to deposit the crockery he collected into the sink, and rushing back to where Dean stood with all the pieces in his hand. "Just tell me where to put this," Dean said gently. "Here," the waiter replied, holding out his own cupped hands. Dean sighed and cautiously deposited the broken pieces into the waiter's hands, their fingers brushing momentarily. The contact caused the waiter to inhale sharply, and he looked up into Dean's hazel green eyes for a split second, before his gaze lowered once more to the floor, and he walked behind the counter, dropping the pieces into the bin. "My name's Dean Winchester. I work at the police station down the road," Dean offered, walking up the counter and leaning against it. He watched the waiter wash the used coffee cups vigorously and leave them to drain next to the sink. He wasn't sure if the waiter was even going to acknowledge his statement. He was about to turn and leave when he heard the waiter exhale softly. "Castile Novak," the reply finally came. "Castile," Dean repeated, trying out the interesting name. "Well, if you ever need help with those guys, call me, alright?" He pulled out his business card and offered it to Castile. The waiter approached him tentatively and hesitantly plucked the business card out of Dean's hand. It was then that Dean noticed his bruised knuckles. What happened here? He asked, keeping the accusatory tone out of his voice. Castile quickly withdrew his hand and placed it in the business card into the front pocket of his apron. And nothing. I was clumsy, fell down. Is that how you got the black eye? Dean asked, keeping his voice calm and steady. It was at this moment that he noticed Castile's split lip. And the busted lip? Castile reached up with delicate fingers to gingerly touch the red cut on his lip. Ooh, I guess so. He replied. Yow, you should go now. Thank you for before. But I need to get things ready for the lunch rush. Okay, Dean said, pushing off the diner's counter. But you call me if anything happens, alright? Anytime. I work 1 block that way and live 2 blocks the other way. I can get here pretty quick. Remember that, okay? Cause? I can call you that, yeah? Castile didn't say anything but nodded his consent and turned back to the counter, pulling up a rag to start cleaning. Dean sighed and walked back out the door, the bell dinging as it opened and closed. When he walked past the windows again, he chanced a glimpse back inside to see Kaz watching him walk off. Dean really did hope that Castile would call him. He'd seen enough domestics to know exactly what was going on. The man was in a relationship that clearly was only working for one person, and that person wasn't Kaz. But Dean couldn't very well help him without proof, and he couldn't help Kaz if Kaz didn't want to help himself. Dean sighed again. It was going to be a long day. At 10 o'clock that night, Castile was finally closing up the diner. The last few customers had just left, and he'd locked the front door and pulled down the blinds on the door and windows, so he could start cleaning. He truly was thankful for Dean Winchester that morning. That altercation was tame compared to other mornings alone with Crowley, Zachariah, and Uriel. He didn't understand the unbridled hatred they had for him. If they disliked him so much, why didn't they just go to another diner for breakfast and coffee? He angrily wiped at the tables, wincing as the movement made the dark bruise on his arm throb even more. He'd already looked at it a couple hours ago. Alistair was going to be mad that someone else had made a mark on him. A steady knock at the door made him jump. Speak of the devil took a deep breath and unlocked the door to come face to face with the older man. Castile, Alistair murmured, winding a hand around the smaller man's waist and closing the door behind them. How was your day? He asked, locking the door. The sound made Kaz swallow nervously. It was good, Alistair, Kaz said, trying not to cringe when the other man kissed his neck. How was yours? Crap, Alistair replied, and Castile froze. Why? Because the health inspectors want to look at this dump day after tomorrow, Alistair replied, and Kaz insides twisted. But I'm sure you can get it all nice and clean for them, right? Kaz nodded without hesitation. He didn't need to anger Alistair anymore. Are you done down here? Alistair asked, gesturing to the tables. Almost. If you go upstairs, I'll be right up, alright? Alistair's hand moved from Castile's waist up to the back of his neck, and he squeezed, forcing Kaz's head backwards, so that the smaller man was looking up at Alistair. Don't be long, he said before harshly letting him go. With that, he stalked to the back of the restaurant, to the door marked staff only, through it and upstairs to their shared apartment. Kaz let out the breath he'd been holding and rubbed the back of his neck unhappily. There'd be more bruises there tomorrow. More ammunition for Zachariah and his cronies to taunt him about. He quickly finished cleaning the tables, put the sponge back next to the sink, hung up his apron and switched off the lights. Then, after taking a deep breath, he ascended the stairs, head hung low. The next morning, Castile Novak dragged himself from the double bed. He thanked every god in existence for Alistair. Having already left for the day, he worked as a lawyer a few blocks away on 8th Street, and always left early for work. He was so driven by greed. It was what had made him buy the diner and the apartment above it in the first place. Castile had been working there for years, and renting the apartment upstairs before Alistair bought it, and the older man had practically bought Castile along with it. He paid Castile well for his day in, day out work in the diner, and didn't charge him rent, but he ruled with an iron fist. A fist that had left new bruises on Kaz's cheekbone and jaw. Kaz had gamely refused sex that night, and Alistair's reply had been a punch across the face, which sent him to the floor, and a few well-aimed kicks to Castile's midsection. Kaz walked stiffly into the bathroom and turned on the light inside. How was he supposed to explain away his face to his customers? What if Dean came back in and started asking questions again? He carefully peeled off his t-shirt and grimaced at the new bruises covering his ribs. He'd have to be mindful at work today so as not to make them worse. It was hard enough pleasing Alistair when he wasn't black and blue. He had a quick shower and got dressed. A white shirt and black jeans would do, he decided. Kaz was just unlocking the door when Anna arrived. She worked as the cook most days, and on her days off Kaz just did everything and fell into bed exhausted. When the Redeed caught a look at Castiel's face, her own smile vanished. Kaz, what happened to your face? She asked, reaching a hand up to gently touch the bruises on his eye, cheekbone and jaw. He tried not to wince at her ministrations and turn away, her hand dropping. It's nothing I can't handle, he said, moving to the counter to grab the bowls of sugar and creamers, and placing one of each on the tables. She grabbed his arm to stop him, but unfortunately it was almost in the exact same spot where Uriel had seized him the day before, and he dropped the bowl of creamers, the bowl breaking, and the little tubs of half-naf spilling out onto the floor. He gasped and brushed her hand away, crouching down to once again pick up the broken pieces of the bowl. An errant thought passed through his mind, Alistair is going to kill me if I keep breaking his crockery, and he shivered at the notion. Castiel, please, tell me what is going on, Anna pleaded with her friend. Sure, she'd seen the bruises before, but whatever was happening seemed to be having a cumulative effect on her workmate. If Castiel had been fairly timid when she'd met him over the last few years, he had grown despondent and practically subservient and submissive. Her friend just shook his head firmly, picked up the rest of the broken porcelain, and dropped them in the trash, leaving Anna standing alone. She huffed out an angry breath and grabbed her apron. As she was starting up the kitchen, getting hot plates warm and pulling out cartons of eggs, Castiel set up the tables. He placed a bowl of sugar and a bowl of creamers on each, along with a napkin holder and a basket full of knives, forks and spoons. Alistair didn't approve of the help-yourself attitude Kaz had to setting the tables, but if he was only going to hire 2 people to work in the diner, Castiel didn't have time to be handing out cutlery when and where it was needed. Just as he was putting the cutlery and napkins onto the last booth in the back corner, the bell above the door rang out. He looked at his scratched old watch. It was only just 8 o'clock. He was about to yell out closed when he turned and saw who it was. Dean. The detective was wearing jeans, a plaid shirt and a leather jacket, and, if Castiel was being really honest, he looked ridiculously hot. He was pretty sure that expression was plastered all over his face, so he turned back around and quickly walked behind the counter. Weru, not really open yet, Anna called grumpily from the kitchen. She really wasn't a morning person. It's okay, Anna, I've got it, Castiel said. What are you after? He asked Dean, keeping his head down so his new bruises wouldn't be seen. Unfortunately, they were the first thing Dean had noticed when he'd walked in, but he kept his mouth shut about them. Just coffee if you've got it going, please. Black. Castiel nodded and proceeded to fill up the percolator with water, coffee grounds, and then switched it on. Silence reigned in the diner, with the exception of the coffee drip and Anna banging things around in the kitchen. Do those guys come in every morning? Dean asked, fishing for information. It was one of the reasons he was here so early. If he could act as a deterrent, then that would be one free act of kindness for the day. What day's today? Castiel inquired absent-mindedly as he watched coffee jug fill up. He pulled out a cup and saucer. Friday. No, today's the one day they don't come in, Castiel said, looking up at Dean with a smile. The authenticity of his smile was so overpowering to Dean, it almost cancelled out the black and blue marks on his face. But as soon as that thought crossed his mind, Kaz noticed him taking in the bruises, and dropped his gaze again. Hey, you don't need to hide them from me, Kaz, Dean said softly. He reached over the counter towards Castiel, but the other man shrank back from his hand. Don't, Kaz murmured. Please didn't come near me. Two don't like people touching me. Dean held up his hands in a soothing gesture. It's okay, I didn't mean anything by it. At that point, Anna stuck her head out of the door that led into the kitchen. The look on her face was obvious. Kaz sighed and turned towards her. I'm fine. Really? Anna nodded and slipped back into the kitchen, tying up her long red hair as she went. Kaz, please, I just want to help, Dean pressed. Can you tell me who did that to you? Here's your coffee. Dean, would you like it to go? No, I think I'll stay, Dean replied, and the coffee was pushed in front of him a little too harshly, as a few drops flew out of the cup and onto the saucer. Kaz looked up apologetically, and Dean could see the fear present in the cobalt blue depths of his eyes, but the policeman simply plucked a napkin out of the nearest stainless steel holder, lifted up the cup, and placed it back down with the napkin in between the cup and saucer. Please let me help you, Kaz. Was it those guys from the precinct who did it? I don't need your help, Dean, Castile replied. His tone grew defensive. And I don't want it. Come on, I know what those guys are like. They have that whole boys club mentality. As soon as they see anyone weaker than themselves, they pounce. Dean quickly realized what he'd said and started to backtrack. Not that I think that you're weak. It's just you're not Aussie, don't know because them. Nicely done, Dean, and no, it wasn't them, Castile snapped back at him. Look, just tell me who it was and why it happened, alright? I have a duty of care to the people of this town, I guess, and, well, you're one of them, Dean stammered. I, can't have the citizens of Lawrence being, mistreated unfairly. If I tell you, will you leave it alone? For today at least, Castile asked, despairingly. Dean was surprised he had relented so easily, but then Cause didn't strike Dean as someone who would stand up for themselves a hell of a lot. It seemed like he'd had that beaten out of him. Dean nodded in answer to his question, and took a sip of his coffee. It was my boyfriend, Cause finally said once he'd decided that there was no turning back. His mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario, of Dean arresting Alistair, of Castile not pressing charges, because he never would, Alistair beating the living shit out of him, then tossing him out onto the street for the night, if not forever. It wouldn't be the first time he'd slept, shivering and afraid, in the doorway, with blood drying on his face. Castile imagined Dean jumping to his feet and running to the precinct to get a warrant signed, but the detective's reaction was the complete opposite. He just nodded again and took another gulp of hot, black coffee. You two have a fight, Dean stated. It was a question. Castile nodded. This isn't the first time he's done this, is it? Castile shook his head. No. That black eye and split lip you had yesterday was from him too, wasn't it? Castile nodded again. And now I'd hazard a guess that you've got bruises all up and down your left side. At that, Castile looked up sharply. How did you know that? I can tell by the way you're favoring it, Dean said. You're only stretching out your right arm. You're not carrying anything heavy in your left hand. Even the way you're leaning on the counter all points to being pretty black and blue right about now. I'm a cop, Cause. I'm meant to be good at picking up on things. Castile immediately shifted his position, but the movement pulled on the abused muscles, and he winced. He let out a short, humorless laugh. I suppose you're right then. So, what are you going to do now? What do you mean? Dean asked, curiously. What are you going to do with your newfound knowledge? Well, that depends on you. Cause, Dean replied evenly. Now it was Castile's turn to ask what the other meant. I can't do anything about it by myself, he said. But I do know one thing. I know what it's like to be in that situation. I know you feel like you can't extricate yourself from it, like you can't escape. I had a boyfriend like that too, a long time ago. Castile's ears pricked at the mention of the word boyfriend, and he immediately chastised himself. What would Alistair think? I know you feel like there is no way out, but there is. I promise you. Dean, you don't understand, Cause said, miserably. What don't I understand? I have nothing. Without him, Cause started to explain, but Dean interrupted. It feels like that now, but... No, I mean, I will have nothing if I leave him. He owns this diner. He owns the apartment I live in, Cause continued, his voice getting softer and softer as he went on until it was almost a whisper when he added, he owns me, Dean. I can't leave him. Dean looked up into Castile's glassy blue eyes, the unshed tears making them all the more vibrant, and Dean understood. He knew the predicament well. He'd seen it 1,000 times on the job, and he'd been in it himself before. After a beat, Cause tore his eyes away from Dean and busied himself in behind the counter, pulling out all the supplies he'd need for the morning. A couple minutes later, the doorbell rang and in walked an older man who sat in one of the booths. Cause greeted him by name and told Anna, Rick wants the usual, before pouring another cup of coffee and setting it down in front of the man. Dean's sharp ears heard the concerned question from the diner's patron and Cause bullshit excuse for the bruises on his face. But he didn't leave. He asked Castile for another refill of coffee and a piece of toast, and sat up at the counter quietly eating breakfast, watching the goings-on. Today was his day off and he would stay here all morning if he had to. Make sure Zachariah and his idiot friends didn't come in. An hour later, Dean saw them walk past the windows. Friday was a busy day for them. Dean knew it was paperwork day, and since none of them liked doing it, they all had to do it. Uriel caught sight of him and whispered in Zachariah's ear. Dean saw Zachariah shrug, and the three men continued past the diner and towards the police station. They had to be the worst cops Dean had ever met. They hardly ever did any of the tedious stuff, like paperwork. They were far more interested in busting petty thieves and drug dealers. And since not much of that happened in Lawrence, a nice little town in Kansas, they spent most of their day on their asses. Or, Dean supposed, victimizing poor Castile. When Dean turned back around to face the counter, he saw Castiel watching them cross the road, and he exhaled, relieved. He looked up at Dean, who smiled at him. "Thank you," he said, so softly Dean almost missed it. "Anytime," Dean replied. Dean stayed in the diner for another hour to make sure that Zachariah, Uriel, and Crowley didn't make a surprise appearance. Before laying a $20 note on the table and pushing his chair back, he started walking towards the door when a gentle hand clutched his elbow. He turned to see Kaz there, holding his money. "Dean, this is far too much. Your check is worth $5. If that," Kaz said, trying to give Dean his money back. "Hey, don't worry about it, Kaz," Dean said, smiling at the waiter. Every instinct was telling him it was a bad move. What he was about to say next, considering the guy already had a boyfriend, even if he was obviously a complete asshole, but he said it anyway. "It was worth it. I got to see you smile." He pressed the money back into Castiel's hand and opened the diner's door, giving Kaz a little wave as he left. An odd Castiel walked back to the till and rang up Dean's check. It had come to the grand total of $4.20. He pulled out the change and put the remaining $15.80 into the empty tip jar and smiled to himself. At 8:30, after the dinner rush had ended, Anna cleaned up the kitchen. She hung her apron on the hook and walked out into the diner. Castiel was busying himself with making sure the countertop was extra clean, seeing as there was only one other customer in the diner, sitting in the corner, staring into his coffee cup. "You'll be all right?" Anna said, gesturing to the man in the corner. He was a big, beefy guy, but he didn't seem to pose any threat. "Yeah, I'll be fine," Anna Castiel replied, stopping what he was doing to talk to her. "He comes in all the time, just sits there, drinking coffee." "You don't look fine, Kaz," Anna said, eyes moving pointedly to the bruises on his face. He was a good friend to her, and she didn't want to see him get even more hurt than he already was. She was never around when Alistair came by, but if she ever met the guy, she'd beat him to hell and back just for laying one finger on her friend. Kaz knew that, so he made sure to leave the roster on the back of the door, so Alistair knew when the diner closed, and when Anna was working or not. Castiel had hired Anna after begging Alistair to let him. He was so exhausted at the end of each day that he was asleep before his head hit the pillow, and that was no fun for Alistair. So he'd finally relented and let Kaz hire a cook. He'd never met Anna, but he didn't want to purely on principle. "I'm fine, Anna, I promise," he said. His voice dropped to almost a whisper when he added, "You know I can handle it. But what if he goes too far?" "Kaz?" Anna whispered back. "What then?" "Anna, he won't, you know that. Anyway," this Kaz motioned to the bruises, "this was my fault, not his." "Kaz, you do know how you sound right now?" Anna replied. "What did you do to deserve it then?" "I'm not going to talk about the details of my relationship with you," Anna, Kaz said, his voice still a whisper, but a stern one. "Fine, I'm only trying to help, we all are, Kaz, but you don't want it," Anna said angrily. "See you tomorrow." And with that she tugged open the door and slammed it shut, the bell dinging plaintively in response. Kaz sighed and finished what he was doing, moving the bowls of creamer and sugar back off the tables and behind the counter. After that, he put the cutlery and napkins away, making sure to leave everything as is on the table in the corner where the last customer for the night was sitting. As he was neatening up behind the counter, the man stood up and walked over to him. "Would you like anything else, sir?" Kaz said, looking up, but he froze when he saw the Bowie knife in the man's hand. "Yep, I'd like what's in that till," the man replied darkly. "Yow, you what?" "Sorry," Castiel stuttered, his heart starting to pound. He dropped his hand to his back pocket and pulled out his phone. If he could delay this guy, he might be able to get help. He thanked whatever had possessed him to program Dean's mobile number into his phone, and speed dialed him. Dean had just finished dinner 2 blocks away in his small apartment when he heard his phone ring. He left the dishes in the sink, wiped his hands on a towel and picked it up. It was an unknown number. He answered anyway, and what he heard made his blood run cold. "I want the money in your goddamn till. Is that too hard for you to understand?" The voice sounded harsh and deep, and Dean frowned, trying to comprehend what he was hearing. The man obviously wasn't talking to him, and whoever had called him had placed his phone somewhere nearby to where this was happening, so that Dean could hear. Okay, I'll get it for you, alright?" The responding voice made Dean hang up. He knew that voice and he knew where he needed to be right now. He jammed his boots back on, grabbed his jacket, keys, gun and police radio, and was out the door in minutes, taking the stairs 2 at a time in his race to get to the street. As he was running, he radioed the precinct. "This is Winchester. Get any available officers down to the diner on the corner of 5th and Michigan. Robbery in progress. I'm on my way now." "Copy that, detective. Sending officers now." Dean pocketed the radio and pushed open the front doors of his apartment building and ran out onto the street. He dodged pedestrians in a bid to get to the diner in time. He couldn't let Kaz down now. Meanwhile, Kaz was trying desperately to keep his heart rate under control as he opened up the till and started to pull the notes out. Apparently, he wasn't going fast enough as the man circled around the counter and came to his side, jabbing the knife into Kaz's ribs. Kaz could feel the tip of the Bowie knife tugging on his shirt, pulling threads loose, and he swallowed nervously. Faster, the man said, digging the knife in incrementally. The tip tore a hole in the side of Kaz's white shirt and came to rest on his bare skin. Please, I'm going as fast as I can. Where do you want it? Castile begged, his hands full of notes. Just put it on the counter. I'll get it in a minute, the man replied. Castile reached forward to put the money on the counter, the movement stretching his injured side, making him grimace. Thanks, gorgeous, the man said, twisting the knife slightly, so it cut Kaz shallowly, making him gasp. The man walked out from behind the counter and started to put the notes calmly into the pockets of his jacket, leaving Castile standing there, shaking, blood from the cut on his side slowly staining his white shirt red. The man turned to leave and Kaz felt relief, but only for a split second. The man stopped, noticing the tip jar. I'll have that too, thanks. Castile looked up at the tip jar. It only had a few coins and Dean's $20 note from this morning. The robber was just being cruel now. Kaz shook his head no and picked up the tip jar, putting it behind the counter. I'm sorry, did you not see the massive knife I'm carrying? The man said. Give me the rest of the money now. No, Kaz whispered, backing away from the man and towards the door that led upstairs to the apartment. In 3 quick strides the man was right in his face, and Castile's throat was grabbed. Kaz choked on the meaty hand that held his neck, clawing desperately at it to get some air. What the hell is wrong with you? You got a death wish? 2 can't give it you. Kaz managed to get out. Either you're stupid or no. You're just stupid, the man said and threw Castile against the counter. Kaz struck the edge of the counter with his head, and was unconscious before he hit the ground. Hey, asshole, turn around and put your hands in the air. The man spun around to see a gun pointed right at him. You got a problem hearing what I'm saying? Dean asked breathlessly. Put your goddamn hands in the air. The man dropped the Bowie knife. It clattered to the floor, and Dean's stomach turned when he saw the tip was bloody, up against the counter. Now, Dean said, his voice growing dark. As he cuffed the man, backup arrived from the station. Call an ambulance, Dean shouted to the officers as the would-be thief was dragged away. Ambulance is on its way, came a shout from one of the officers. Dean nodded and holstered his gun, running to where Castile lay. He quickly took stock of the injuries he could see. The robber had cut him in the side with his knife, but it wasn't deep and, despite the blood tinting his shirt, it had already started to clot. His temple was bloody too. Kaz had hit the counter hard, but until he regained consciousness, if he did, Dean wouldn't know how bad his concussion would be. While waiting for the ambulance, he lifted Castile up slightly, so that his upper half was resting in Dean's lap. Deep down, Dean knew he shouldn't move him in case there were other injuries, but he couldn't bring himself to just leave Kaz lying on the cold, hard floor of the diner. Thankfully, he got the answer to whether or not Kaz had a concussion pretty soon. Dean heard a soft groan from his lap, and looked down to see Kaz's eyes fluttering open. Dean? Yeah, hey, it's me, Dean said quietly. I got your call. I saw you hang up though? Kaz questioned, his voice hoarse. I know, I had to, so I could get here quicker, Dean explained, hearing the sirens in the distance. You'll come to save me, Kaz whispered, more to himself than Dean. Of course I did, Kaz. I'd never just let someone hurt you. I'm only sorry I couldn't get here sooner, Dean replied. Don't be sorry, Dean. You got here, that's all that matters, Kaz said. He reached up a hand and took Dean's hand in his own. Dean could still feel him shaking from the after effects of the robbery. Thank you. Dean was letting the moment take him over, and was surprised when a loud voice outside made Kaz jump in his lap. He turned to see a gray-haired man pushing his way through the crowd of onlookers to the police tape that had been set up. He looked kind of familiar, but Dean couldn't place him immediately. What the hell is going on here? The older man shouted again. Dean heard the police officers trying to calm the man down and make him back off, but to no avail. I own this establishment. I demand that you let me pass so I can see if my staff are okay. The words shook both Dean and Kaz to their very cores. This was Kaz's boyfriend, Dean thought. Please, Dean, Kaz whispered. Please don't let him in. But the man was already past the officers and police tape, and was about to enter the diner. I can't stop him, Kaz. He owns the place, Dean replied sadly. He quickly let go of Castile's hand. He wouldn't want to make things worse for the poor man. He helped Kaz to his feet and supported him as the older man barged up to them. Castiel, what the fuck is going on here? He shouted and Kaz flinched. Whoa, hold on a minute there, Dean said, holding a hand, trying to calm the older man down. But it didn't seem to be working. The man was absolutely livid. Kaz was the victim of a robbery, Dean explained. Kaz, with his eyes trained meekly on the floor, nodded in agreement. Kaz? The older man repeated, frowning at the nickname. You haven't let me call you that in years. You're gonna let some stranger call you that? Dean worked hard to keep the shocked look off his face. Kaz had been with this bastard for years? Dean had only known him a few minutes, and already he knew that he was an A-grade asshole. He's not a stranger, Alistair, Kaz said, making sure to keep any defiance out of his voice and his body language. Dean's a friend. Dean, is it? Alistair turned on the detective. And suddenly Dean remembered where he knew the man from. Alistair had represented a number of criminals over the years, and had always made sure to send a death glare the way of the arresting officer, which in a few cases had been Dean. Well, Dean, how do you know my Kaz? Dean didn't miss the fact that he'd referred to Kaz as his property, but answered nonetheless. I'm a detective at the police station down the road. I've stopped in a few times. Well, nice to meet you then, Dean, Alistair snarled. He grabbed Kaz's arm and tugged him towards the door that led upstairs, his actions forcing a cry of pain from Castiel. What the hell are you doing, Alistair? He needs to see a doctor, Dean said as Kaz was pulled from his arms. No, he needs to go upstairs. Get some rest. We both do, Alistair smirked at Dean and dragged Kaz towards the door again. I think we'll be the judge of that. Alistair and Dean turned to see two paramedics standing in the diner. Alistair sighed angrily and propelled Castiel towards them, the injured man stumbling. He would have fallen if it weren't for Dean's steady arms catching him. Kaz turned to see Alistair going through the door and slamming it without a second look back at them, and he let out the breath he'd been holding. Dean helped Kaz to the ambulance where he sat down in the open back doorway of the van, while the paramedics looked him over. Dean stood to one side watching how Castiel barely flinched when they cleaned the bloody wound on his temple and the one on his side. He must be used to this, a little voice in Dean's head murmured. The knife wound didn't need any stitches, and the paramedics bandaged it. Same for the head wound where they placed 2 butterfly stitches. He heard Kaz tell them he'd fallen down the stairs yesterday, as an explanation for the bruises he'd sustained before the robbery. The paramedics exchanged a glance, but there wasn't anything they could do for him, much like Dean, unless he was willing to press charges on Alistair. Finally, when the paramedics were done, Dean walked over. He'd already worked out what he planned to say when the paramedics said the inevitable. You don't need a hospital stay, one of them said hesitantly, knowing to whom he was throwing Castiel back to. But, do you have a place to stay tonight? Yep, he does, Dean jumped in. Kaz looked up and Dean could once again see those same emotions in his blue eyes. Pain, fear, anger, but hope seemed to be winning out over the other 3. Are you sure, Dean? Kaz asked. He never caught any breaks. Why would he now? Yeah, I'm sure. Hey Tim, would you mind just driving us 2 blocks that way? Dean asked one of the paramedics. Not a problem. Buckle up. The 2 of them got into the back of the ambulance, and just as Tim was closing the doors, Kaz chanced to look up at the windows of the apartment and froze. Alistair was there, staring down at him. He only saw him for a moment though because suddenly they were off. Kaz jerked at the sudden movement, and Dean wrapped an arm around his shoulders. It's all right, I've got you, he murmured gently. The ambulance dropped Dean and Castiel off at the entrance to Dean's apartment building, and Dean took off his jacket and draped it over the other man's shoulders, as an icy breeze blew down the street. They took the elevator up to the 3rd floor, and Dean pulled out his keys and unlocked the door to apartment 3C. They stepped into the warm environs of Dean's apartment, and Kaz couldn't help but check it out curiously. It wasn't huge, but it wasn't cramped either. The living room had what looked like an exceptionally comfy couch in front of a TV leading off to a kitchen at one end, and a hallway led to what Kaz assumed were Dean's bedroom and a bathroom. Dean led Kaz into his bedroom, and Kaz took in the neat surroundings. Big double bed with blue comforter, dark wood furnishings, and a stack of books on the bedside table. Sit down, make yourself at home, Dean said as he rifled through his wardrobe. Kaz did as he was told and waited for Dean to finish. The detective pulled out a t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants, and laid them on the bed. Here, why don't you put these on? Kaz looked down at his own clothes. His jeans and shirt were stained with his own blood, and the tear in his shirt had gotten even larger. He nodded and began to unbutton his shirt. I'll just be out there, all right? Dean said, pointing to the couch. Call if you need anything, and the bathroom is right across the hall. And with that, Dean closed over the bedroom door. leaving Castile to his own devices. Kaz finished unbuttoning his shirt and gently shrugged out of it. His bruises were still very tender, and the knife wound, although shallow, definitely stung. With a little difficulty he put on the t-shirt and then slipped on the sweatpants, leaving his own clothes in a neat pile on the floor next to the bedside table. He emerged from the bedroom to find Dean drinking from a bottle of beer on the couch, the TV showing the football game, but muted. Dean heard Kaz and turned around with a smile. "Hey, that's better," Dean said. "I would have offered a shower, but that would be pretty tricky with those bandages." "That's all right, Dean," Kaz replied quickly. "You've already done so much. How can I repay you?" "No, don't ask that, Kaz," Dean said firmly, making Kaz take an involuntary step back. "No, I'm sorry, Kaz. What I meant was you shouldn't have to ask that. I'm your friend, of course I'd help you. You don't need to repay me for it." "Oh okay," Kaz replied, unsure of Dean's words. He stayed standing, awkwardly in the living room before Dean patted the couch next to him. "Why don't you come sit down? Make yourself comfortable?" "Okay," Kaz quickly replied and moved to the couch, making sure to keep distance between himself and Dean. "Do you want anything?" Dean asked, standing up. "A beer? Have you had dinner yet?" Kaz shook his head no. "I'm fine, really," he said earnestly just as his stomach let out a rumble. "Uh-huh," Dean said skeptically. "Look, I'm hungry, so I was going to make a sandwich. How about I make one for you as well?" "If that's all right," Kaz said softly. "Two don't want to trouble you, thought." "Honestly, Kaz, it's no trouble. Pretty sure your stomach rumbling would keep me up at night anyway, if I didn't feed you," Dean joked, but it had the opposite effect on Castile. The other man lowered his eyes to the floor. "I'm sorry." Dean sighed sadly and walked back over to the couch, surprising Kaz when he crouched on the floor in front of him, so that their eyes were level, even though Kaz refused to bring his own gaze up from the carpet. "You don't need to be sorry for that, Kaz," he said gently. "You don't need to be sorry for anything." "Dean, I do," Kaz replied dejectedly. "If I wasn't such a screw-up all the time, then Alistair wouldn't have to." His voice drifted off as he realized what he was about to say. "Alistair wouldn't have to what, Kaz?" "He wouldn't have to punish me for all the things I've done wrong," Kaz finished, tears springing to his eyes. He finally looked up at Dean, and the detective's heart broke when he saw the pain and depression in those cobalt blue eyes, as tears slid down Kaz's face. "It's my fault, all of this," he said, gesturing to himself. "Somehow or another, it's all my fault. It's always been that way." "No, that's not true, Kaz, I promise you," Dean said, reaching up to wipe a tear off Castile's cheek. "You know that's not true. That bastard has been feeding you lies this entire time. And to prove it to you, I promise that I will never, ever hit you or touch you in a way that you wouldn't like." Dean's mind went into overdrive. What the hell was he saying? Was he telling Kaz, this man that he had only just met really 2 days ago, that he would be a better boyfriend than the man Kaz was already with? But his words seemed to lighten Castile's mood. He wiped at his eyes, as his stomach rumbled in hunger again. "How about I get you that sandwich?" Dean said, standing up again, leaving a bewildered but happier Castile on the couch. Dean quickly pulled out bread, cheese, tomato, and ham, and went about making sandwiches for the two of them. He was having a hard time figuring out what the hell he was going to do with Kaz. On the one hand, he couldn't legally do anything about the situation Castile was in, although he made a mental note to call his brother, Sam, who was studying law at Stanford about it. Alastair owned his workplace and his home, and obviously was a complete bastard, abusive and all. But, despite only knowing him briefly, Dean was starting to feel for Castile. If there was one thing his job had nurtured, it was reading people. And Dean was damn good at it. He could tell that Castile only wanted the best for everyone around him. But that willingness to please, coupled with a submissive attitude, had made him easy picking for Alistair. The older man basically had a slave in the diner and a slave in his own home. Dean couldn't believe how sick and twisted some people were, but he'd seen it often enough when on call. Dean came back out into the living room with 2 plates and handed one to Kaz. They ate their very late dinner in silence, and, when he'd finished, Dean stood up and grabbed a few blankets. "I'll take the couch," he said. "No, that's fine. It's your home," Kaz said. "I don't want to be a burden." "Kaz, you are the opposite of a burden. Trust me." Dean smiled. "Now, you can have the bed, all right?" "All right," Kaz replied resignedly, worried of what he'd have to do in return. But to his surprise, Dean just shook out the blankets on the couch, turned off the lights and got comfortable. Kaz retreated to the bedroom and did the same. Early the next morning, Dean shifted on the couch, finding a more comfortable position. Yes, it was a relatively snug couch, but it wasn't as good as Say, the bed. He plucked his phone off the coffee table and checked the time, 4:45 a.m. He placed it back down on the table and was about to turn over and get some more rest, when he heard some quiet shuffling coming from the bedroom. He willed himself to stay still and keep his breathing steady, as he heard quiet footsteps padding down the hall and into the living room. A note was placed delicately on the coffee table. Before his front door was slowly and quietly unlocked, opened and then closed. Dean sighed and picked up the note. Thank you for everything, Dean. I'm sure you understand why I had to leave. See you at the diner soon, X. Dean crumpled up the note in a burst of anger, and then just as quickly as it had risen, the feeling subsided, and he carefully unfolded the note again. He rolled over so he was on his back and looked up at the dark ceiling, picturing Castiel walking gingerly down the stairs, so as not to jostle any injuries. He'd wince when he pulled open the heavy front door, and then he'd wrap his arms around him as he stepped out into the chilly early morning air. Kaz would walk as fast as he could manage down the dark pre-dawn street. Dean knew he wouldn't have the nerve to dawdle when it was so dark, and he was alone. He'd probably unlock the diner's front door with his key, and then go upstairs and lay down next to Alistair. The anger in Dean built up again. How he hated that man right now on so many levels. Dean was right on most counts. Walking down the stairs did aggravate Kaz's wounds, so he took them one step at a time, both literally and metaphorically. Because he'd left Dean's clothes in his bedroom, his own torn white shirt was no match for the freezing morning air, and he wrapped his arms around his midsection, while his teeth started chattering almost immediately. He did indeed hurry down the 2 blocks that separated him from the diner, not wanting to pause near any dark alleys. Kaz pulled his keys out from his pocket and unlocked the diner's front door, closing and locking it behind him. The diner was also bitterly cold. Alistair always turned the heat off at night to save money, even right now in early winter. But Dean's assumption and reality parted ways when Kaz got to the door that led upstairs. He tried the handle. Locked. He pulled his keys out and unlocked the door, but when he turned the knob, it still wasn't open. The deadbolt, he thought miserably. Alistair had locked him out. He'd done this a couple of times before after they'd had a big fight, and Kaz would be forced to huddle in the diner, his fingers numb until morning when Alistair would let him upstairs. Tears sprung to his eyes as he slid down to the cold floor. Why had life given him this problem? He couldn't leave Alistair. If he did, he'd lose his home and his job. He couldn't survive without both. But it wasn't likely that he was going to survive much longer with Alistair. The man hadn't hospitalized him as yet, but he'd been getting angrier and more violent over the last few years. His punches had gotten more frequent, and Alistair wasn't even trying to avoid places that would be seen in public anymore. Maybe he should have stayed at Dean's until morning, he thought. No, then Alistair would be even angrier, he decided. He tried to get into a comfortable position, but it was hard. The floor was cold, the wall was cold, his teeth still hadn't stopped chattering, and now he had started shivering. He stood up again and grabbed both his and Anna's aprons from their hooks, and wrapped himself up in the rough cotton fabric. At least this way he wouldn't get hypothermia, he hoped. But he would still have to face Alistair in the morning, and that wasn't going to be pretty. Dean texted Kaz at a reasonable hour that morning just to see if he was alright, but he received no reply. He walked past the diner on his way to work, but it was closed. He walked back during his lunch break, still closed. On his way home from work, he crossed the road and sat down on the bus seat for around half an hour, watching the upstairs apartment's windows. The lights were on, but the blinds were down, so he couldn't see anything. The diner stayed closed for a week, and Dean started to get really worried. He'd texted Castiel a few times that week, harmless innocent message like just checking up on you after the robbery, need to get a statement down at the station when you're up to it, so that if Alistair saw it wouldn't cause any arguments. He hoped. It had been almost a week and a half when he finally saw the diner open again. Luckily it was his day off, so he decided to spend some time there, make sure Kaz was okay. The little bell rang as he opened the door, and when he did so he saw Kaz straighten up from behind the counter. He looked terrible. His skin was pale, and dark circles bordered his deep blue eyes. He seemed to have lost a little weight as well. His cheeks were more hollow than usual. Hey, Kaz, how are you? Dean asked, taking a seat on one of the stools at the counter. I'm fine, Kaz said, but broke into a coughing fit so severe that Dean rushed around the counter and gently lowered him to the floor when his knees buckled. Kaz, what the hell? Dean asked, causing the other man to flinch as the coughing fit finally abated. What does it look like? Kaz said, in between gasps for breath. I'm sick. Well, why are you working, if you're so sick? Dean asked, in disbelief. Why do you think? Kaz replied, and Dean could tell he was both exhausted and angry. Alistair is making you work? Of course he is, Dean, Kaz said. I got the whole of last week off because I could barely get out of bed. He wasn't going to let me take another week off. Castile got his breathing under control and went to stand up but wavered. Dean caught him gently before he fell. He took a quick look around the diner. It was completely empty of patrons and was also Anna's day off. Why don't you just sit down for a moment? Dean suggested and Kaz nodded in return. Dean helped him over to a booth and gradually lowered him onto the seat and then sat down opposite him. How did you get sick? Dean asked. He almost didn't want to know the answer, but Castile had been keeping this bottled up for some time. He could tell. Maybe if he helped Kaz realize that what Alistair was doing was wrong was abuse, then he might be able to save Kaz. It was my fault, Kaz said wearily, studying his hands so he wouldn't have to look at Dean. Please, Kaz, tell me how, Dean pressed. When I got home from your place that night, Alistair had locked me out, Kaz said, sniffing back tears. He didn't want to look even weaker in front of Dean, if possible. Outside? Dean asked, shocked. No, just in here, Kaz said, referring to the diner. But he turns the thermostat off at night. So I may as well have been outside. I was only locked out for a couple hours before he left for the morning. But it was enough to make me sick, I guess. Of course it was enough, Kaz. It was freezing last night. And you were injured already, Dean said, shaking his head sadly. You know this isn't right, you know that, don't you? At that, Castile looked up and locked eyes with Dean, his exhausted blue eyes meeting Dean's green ones, so considerate and compassionate. He looked away. He couldn't deal with this. Not now. He was feeling too ill. His head pounded. He was both ravenous and nauseous at the same time, and now Dean wanted to have a relationship therapy session. Please, Dean, just leave me be, alright? I'm alive, aren't I? I suppose, Kaz, but you're existing. You're not living. That bastard isn't letting you. Dean said softly. Can you just leave it alone for the moment? Castile pleaded with the detective, his broken voice shattering Dean's heart. Dean took a deep breath and finally nodded in agreement. Do you need any help today? Dean asked. It's my day off. Monday's normally not too busy, but if you want to stick around that's fine by me, Kaz said resignedly. All right, Dean replied, standing up. I'll be right back. What? Where are you going? Kaz asked worriedly, extricating himself from the booth as well. Don't worry, I'll be back in a minute, Dean said. I'm going to get you something. A visible shudder went through Kaz. The last time somebody had gotten him something was when Alistair had pulled out his belt and proceeded to lash him with it one night after he'd talked back. Dean noticed and placed a hand on Kaz's shoulder. He was jumping for joy on the inside when the smaller man didn't flinch or cringe like he had done in the past. It's okay, it'll be good, Dean assured. Didn't I promise you I would never hurt you? Yeah, Kaz said when he'd found his voice. Well, trust me, alright? Dean squeezed his shoulder affectionately and left the diner. He walked back down the street towards his apartment building and the chemist that was on the ground floor there. After buying some painkillers and cold flu drugs, he quickly walked back to the diner to see Castile tiredly setting up the tables. Dean pulled the brown paper bag out of his pocket. What is that? Kaz asked, warily. Painkillers and cold and flu pills, Dean said, pulling both pill bottles out of the brown paper and handing them to Kaz. They won't fix it, but they'll at least dull the symptoms a bit. I'd suggest taking some of the flu ones first up and then painkillers around lunchtime, if you still have a headache. Kaz looked from the drugs back up to Dean, astonished. Alistair had never bought him anything like this. He wanted Kaz to suffer through whatever pain and discomfort ailed him. Even when Kaz had been hit by a car out the front of the diner and had broken his arm, Alistair hadn't allowed him to take any painkillers. Once he was back from the hospital, Kaz put the drugs down, and suddenly, to Dean's surprise, enveloped him in a hug. Thank you so much, Dean, he whispered. Dean patted Kaz tenderly on the back, still getting over his surprise. That's all right, Kaz, anytime. After a moment, Kaz pulled away from the embrace and poured himself a glass of water, and took 2 flu pills, before setting the bottles in one of the drawers under the counter, where Alistair wouldn't know to look. When he turned back to the main diner, he saw Dean carrying the napkin holders and cutlery baskets to the tables. Dean, please, you don't have to do that, he hurriedly said. The last time Alistair had helped him out in the diner, he'd received a black eye for his apparent laziness. He didn't think Dean would hit him on purpose. He kept saying, no, promising that he wouldn't. But Alistair had promised him that too. It's fine, really, Kaz, Dean said. Anyway, you said Monday wasn't a super busy day. Why don't you just sit down for a little while? Let the drugs start working. And make sure to hydrate. Don't want you passing out on me. Another tremor hit Castile at Dean's words. Don't want you passing out on me. He'd lost count of how many times Alistair had said that to him. More often than not, it involved him in a bloody, battered heap on the bedroom floor, trying desperately hard to stop the tears from running down his cheeks. That was another thing Alistair didn't permit in his home. Tears. Cause, you alright? Cause was brought abruptly out of his painful reverie by Dean's voice, and found himself standing in the middle of the diner, Dean's hands protectively placed on his shoulders and tears, inevitably leaving salty tracks down his face. I am sorry, Dean, Castile said, hating himself for how weak he must look. Cause, you don't need to be sorry, Dean said. I do. What did I say? Dean steered Cause gently over to back booth again, and brought him a glass of water, while the other man calmed down. His current ill health was wreaking havoc on his emotional control. What did I say that upset you? Dean asked gently, reaching out to softly wipe off Cause's tears with a napkin. Once again, he relished the fact that Castile not only didn't recoil from his touch, but actually leaned into it subconsciously. It was when you said it taught to pass out, Castile stammered, his voice shaky. Oh Cause, Dean murmured, realizing what had triggered him. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Dean slid around the semicircular booth, so that he was not sitting next to Castile, and not opposite him. Alistair has said that to you before, hasn't he? Yes, Cause whispered. He hates to see me look weak, even though he's the one who makes me weak. He doesn't like to see the effect he has on me. He doesn't let me cry, doesn't let me pass out when he beats me, doesn't let me take any painkillers for the agony he inflicts with his fists and boots, doesn't give me time to heal between beatings or when he takes advantage of me. He believes I will just bounce back every time. But I don't think I can anymore. Dean just sat there, shocked into silence at what he was hearing. This was the first time he'd really heard about the abuse meted out on this poor man. This man that he was, despite his best judgment, falling for rapidly. Dean, Cause's soft question brought him back to the present. He looked up at Castile, studying his deep blue pained eyes. You said you would never hurt me or touch me in a way I wouldn't like. You promised. Yeah, I did, Cause. Dean smiled, lifting his hand up and covering Cause with it, their fingers intertwining instinctually. I promise. Dean, Cause drifted off for a moment. This was the biggest step he'd ever had to take in the last few years. He'd better be sure about it. After a long moment, he decided that, yes, this was what he wanted. Dean, can you help me? Help me out of this? Castile, you have no idea how long I've been waiting for you to ask me that, Dean said, pulling in Cause for another embrace. Castile pulled out of it abruptly though. But what should I do about this place? And my home? Where will I go? He asked, worriedly, his brow furrowing. About this place? Well, once we press charges on Alistair, he will go to jail, and depending on how it all goes, the diner may be able to be salvaged. As for the apartment, would you really want to stay there, after everything that's happened? Dean asked tentatively. Where else would I go though? I know a place, Dean said with a smile. His smile grew wide when Cause cocked his head to the side in question. Mine, silly. Oh, will that be alright? It would be for only a little while, until I find my own place again, Cause assured him. Cause, you can stay at my home, with me for as long as you like. I promise, Dean said, and without even thinking about what he was doing, leant over and kissed Cause on the top of his unruly mop of dark hair. Cause gasped and pulled away, and it was Dean's turn to apologize profusely, but Cause placed a steady finger on his lips, and kissed him chastely on the cheek, making Dean's heart flip-flop in his chest. Thank you, Dean. Anytime, Cause. Dean had stuck around the diner until around 5 p.m. when he got a call from the station. Another detective had called in sick, so he was on call for the night. He bid Cause farewell and headed back home, leaving his police radio on and turned up while he made dinner and watched that night's baseball game. At around midnight it crackled to life, and the words he heard rocked him to his very core. Detective Winchester, we have reports of a domestic disturbance at 58 Michigan Avenue. That's the corner of Michigan Avenue and 5th Street, the apartment above the diner that was held up 2 weeks ago. It seemed to Detective Dean Winchester that the next few moments simultaneously passed by both in a blur of speed and at slow motion. He once again raced out the door grabbing his gun, police badge, radio, handcuffs and keys, and ran full pelt down Michigan Avenue. Seconds later he skidded to a halt outside the diner. He could see other uniforms running towards the diner from the direction of the station, and breathed a sigh of relief. If he had backup, then he wouldn't be tempted to do something he'd regret later. Itiri, shaking Anna, was waiting for him inside the diner, mobile phone in her hand. What happened? He asked breathlessly, his nerves frayed beyond belief. "Two came back here because I realized I'd left my diary here yesterday and when I came in, I saw Alistair dragging Kaz up those stairs, screaming at him about some policeman he was having an affair with. His face was already covered in blood like he'd hit him," Anna explained in between sobs. "I've been wanting to call you guys on Alistair for ages, but I had no actual proof." Despite his mouth having gone dry at Anna's recollection of Alistair accusing Kaz of cheating with some policeman, Dean summoned up all his strength and nodded in response to her, studying the door and beating his fist on it. "Open up, police!" he shouted at the closed door. The other officers ran into the diner and saw Dean preparing to kick in the door. "Wait, detective, we don't have a warrant," one of them said. "Does that even matter?" Anna screamed hysterically. "Alistair is going to kill him if you don't go in there." "Fuck getting a warrant," Dean replied angrily, aiming for the lock. In two powerful kicks the door was thrown inwards and was hanging precariously from only one hinge. "I'm going up there, Anna, stay down here, okay?" She nodded and he pulled out his gun and badge and raced up the stairs, the other officers following close on his heels. The stairs led him up to another door which he also kicked in, not even bothering to knock. The scene he was met with would be one he wouldn't forget in a long time. The door opened into the main living room of the upstairs apartment. For a split second he was actually surprised at how big and nicely furnished it was, and then his attention was laser focused on the two men standing in the center of the room. Alistair was holding a beaten, bloody Castiel by the collar of his shirt when Dean burst in and threw him down to the floor hatefully. Kaz wasn't wearing a shirt, and Dean could see his back was covered in blood. Lacerations, bruises and welts fought for space and crisscrossed over each other, and Dean could barely spot a patch of skin that was untouched. Kaz landed hard on the floor on his hands and knees with a cry of pain, and Alistair threw a leather belt, covered in blood, to the floor next to him. Kaz was gasping for breath and weeping from the agonizing pain stemming from his back. His face was indeed bloody, as Anna had described, with the viscous red liquid oozing out his nose, his mouth, and from various cuts and wounds. "Ah, the return of the fearless detective," Alistair boomed out as the uniformed police officers gathered behind Dean's back and took in the horrible display. "I suppose you want your pet back?" he sneered scathingly. "I'm almost done with him." He crouched down next to Kaz, who whimpered in fear and tried shuffling away from his abuser. Alistair grabbed his throat and shook his head. "Oh, no, you stay right here until I finish teaching you your lesson." "Get your fucking hands off him now," Dean demanded, surprising himself with the amount of venom and fury in his voice. "Or what?" Alistair mocked. He stood up, hauling Kaz up with him by the throat, and slammed him against the wall. Castiel screamed in pain as his shredded back suddenly made contact with the rough brick walls. Alistair's hand tightened around his neck, and spots appeared in his vision. "Let him go now, or I swear to God." Dean strode up to Alistair and placed his cocked gun up against the man's head. "I will blast your fucking brains out, you sick son of a bitch." Alistair sighed dramatically as Castiel's eyes rolled back into his head. "I suppose you've got me then." He opened his hand, and Kaz crumpled to the floor in a boneless, bloody heap. "Cuff him, now," Dean ordered the uniforms. Two of them quickly rushed up and cuffed Alistair and dragged him away from Dean. "Call an ambulance," Dean shouted to the other cops. As Alistair was being heaved out of the apartment and down the stairs, Dean knelt by Castiel's still form. He placed two fingers ever so gently on his neck, almost fearing what he'd find. He let out a relieved breath when he felt a faint heartbeat. "Oh, thank God," he breathed. It didn't escape him that this was the second time in as many weeks that he'd been waiting for an ambulance for Kaz. But this time, Kaz didn't wake up before it got there. 1 week later, the first thing he noticed was an incessant beeping noise. His first thought upon hearing the sound was that he'd better find out what that noise was, and fast, before Alistair beat him black and blue because of it. The next thing he noticed was that the bed he was laying in didn't feel like his bed at home. It seemed stiffer. The sheets smelled different to those he slept in normally, and it seemed to be at a strange, slightly upward angle. The third thing he noticed was that someone was holding his hand. Castiel slowly opened his eyes, wincing at the bright white light. When he became accustomed to the glare and looked around himself, he suddenly got very, very worried. He was clearly in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, an IV was trailing out of his arm, and oxygen was being pumped into the tube that wound around his nose and ears. He looked to his left and saw Dean. The detective was the one holding his hand, but he'd also pillowed his arms on Kaz's bed. His head was resting on them, and he was sound asleep. Kaz attempted to say the policeman's name, but all that came out was a quiet, hoarse croak. He tried clearing his throat, and the movement brought so much pain to that area tears pricked at his eyes. He tried speaking again. Dean, he rasped. Dean, wake up. His voice, despite being softer than a whisper and rougher than sandpaper, woke the detective immediately. Green eyes met blue, and suddenly Dean was crying. Oh my God, Cause, you're awake, Dean said softly as tears of both happiness and despair rolled down his face. I am so sorry, I didn't get there quicker. I ran as fast as I could. But you're okay, and that's what matters. Memories flooded back into Castiel's mind, and he looked over to Dean in awe. You saved me, he whispered. Again. Of course I did, Cause, Dean smiled. I just wish I'd saved you sooner. How long was I out? Cause asked tentatively. The doctors kept you in an induced coma for about 5 days to let you heal. Alistair banged you up pretty good. You've been unconscious for the last 2, Dean said, wiping his wet eyes with the back of his sleeve. And Cause drifted off for a moment. He wasn't sure if he wanted to ask the next question. He summoned up the courage and looked back up at Dean. And what do the doctors say? Dean took a deep breath. He'd completely broken down when the doctors had first told him Castiel's list of injuries. He'd have to be strong for Cause though. The lacerations on your back are pretty bad. Some of them had to stitched up, they were so deep. 5 of your ribs are broken, 10 are cracked, and the rest are probably all bruised. You've got a broken collarbone on your right side. Your right arm is also broken in 2 places. You had a severe concussion, and there are signs of rape. Dean's voice cracked on the last word, and he cursed himself mentally. He watched Cause take it all in, and noticed that he didn't seem all that shocked. You don't seem surprised? Dean asked. No, it's definitely the worst time, Cause admitted sadly. But no, I'm not really surprised. It's probably the worst thing I've ever done to him. What? What are you talking about? Dean questioned, at a loss as to what Cause was referring to. Cheating on him. It's the worst thing I've ever done to him, Cause confessed. But we didn't even do anything. Cause, you know there was nothing for him to be angry about, Dean argued gently. Yes, there was. I told him I was going to leave, Cause said. And he assumed it was so I could be with you. I didn't see the point in arguing with him, so he just thought it was a done deal. If I'd argued with him, it would have been worse. How much more badly could it get? Dean asked, his voice raising. You're in hospital with broken bones, and Dean stopped himself hallway though, so he didn't shout the last part, but instead calmly added it. He raped you, Cause. At that, Castiel broke down. The tears came streaming out of blackened, bloodshot blue eyes, and Dean immediately encased him in an embrace, making sure that he didn't press on or inadvertently bump any injuries. Cause, that man, that bastard, abused you, Dean said, the words making Castiel shudder in his arms. He beat you and bullied you and raped you for years. That's not how it's meant to be. That's not what a relationship is. That's not what love is. Love shouldn't hurt you like that. If you let me, I can show you what love is. Dean pulled back slightly so that Cause could look him in the eye. Dean took in Castiel's battered face, the bruises around his eyes, on his cheekbone, on his jaw and wrapped around his neck, the split lip and black stitches on a gash on his temple. Cause studied Dean. How his eyes displayed only kindness, affection and the desire to help him, to respect him, and maybe one day, to love him. He nodded in response to Dean's offer. I'd like that, Dean, he said softly. I'd like that very much. 3 weeks. Castiel had stayed in hospital for the next 3 weeks, while he healed from his injuries. Dean, who hadn't taken a holiday in almost 10 years, took the next 2 months off with pay, so he could make sure Cause was alright. The broken arm and collarbone would take around 2 months to heal, same with his ribs. The lacerations on his back would scar badly, but they wouldn't leave any permanent damage. While in hospital, Dean found out a lot about Cause and vice versa. Anna came in every other day, or when her college courses allowed, to visit, and Dean and her got on well, in that they both wanted the best for Castiel. He'd found out that Cause and Anna had met during college in the administration office when she was enrolling, and he was dropping out. Cause's father didn't support him. Dean gathered from the brief explanation given. Balthazar, an ex-boyfriend of Cause from his college days, popped in once or twice. He lived 2 towns over, and they hadn't spoken since before Castiel and Alistair had gotten together. Dean was a little worried about the 2 of them speaking privately. He didn't want to call it jealousy, but that's clearly what it was. But it seemed he had nothing to worry about, according to Balthazar, who smiled at him when he left, saying, well, I have to say, dear Cassie did always have a thing for Policeman. Sam, Dean's brother, dropped in a few times. He decided to bring his girlfriend, Jessica, out to Lawrence to see their hometown on a conveniently placed winter break. The 2 of them came in and met Castiel. Jess, a nursing major, studying his charts to see how he was progressing, and happily telling both Dean and Kaz that the patient was well and truly on the road to recovery. One rainy afternoon, while Jess was chatting to a sleepy Kaz, Sam gently tugged Dean out of the hospital room he'd called home for the last 3 weeks and into the hallway. I got your messages last week. I hadn't been able to do a huge amount of research on it yet, but I think I may have found a loophole, Sam said. You did? Dean asked, excited but knowing to keep his voice down. Yeah, so I've been speaking with Castiel's doctor about his injuries, and apparently had you not broken down the door and rescued him, Kaz would be dead. What? Dean exclaimed, horrified. He ran a hand through his hair trying to process that thought. Those ribs that were broken, one of them had a sharp edge heading straight for Castiel's lung. If you hadn't called the ambulance when you did, or if, heaven forbid, Alistair had beaten him further, Castiel would have been dead in 2 hours, give or take, Sam explained. He pulled out a couple papers from his messenger bag. And according to Office Part Hair Section 42A, if the victim is wounded fatally, and the decision to proceed without a warrant determines whether or not the victim dies, the absence of a warrant can be waived at the presiding judge's discretion, and a formal trial may ensue. So I'm off the hook for it? Dean asked. Looks like. I've also spoken to Judge Murray. He'll be presiding over the trial, which will begin once Kaz is healthy enough to testify. Wait, you need Kaz to testify? Can't we just go on mine and Anna's witness statements? No, there's a sub-clause to the no warrant bit which states that the victim must testify against the accused, so the jury can understand how dire the circumstances were, Sam clarified. Damn it, Dean said softly. You know what this is going to do to him? Yeah, I know, but he has to do it, otherwise Alistair could walk. You're joking, right? Far from it. I'm sorry, but he has to, otherwise the case will be thrown out because you didn't have a warrant, Sam said, trying to let his brother down gently. He placed a hand on Dean's shoulder. I'm sure you can help him through this. You had to testify yourself, don't forget. Sammy, I couldn't forget that even if I tried, Dean said with a humorless laugh. But I fought back, Cascas just took it. For years. Didn't even try and stop it. I'm sure you can help him do it, Dean, Sam assured. You're already helping him now. Dean nodded and decided that now was most definitely not the time to tell Kaz about testifying. As it was, the trial wouldn't go ahead for another month at least, and Alistair would be held in custody without bail until then. There wasn't any way in hell that Dean would let him near Castiel unless he really had to. It's going to be hard for him, though, Dean murmured. He studied the man in the hospital bed, the man he was slowly but surely falling for. It was hard for me. I know, but look what you did. Michael's now in jail for hurting you. You did the right thing. Now you've just got to convince Castiel to do it too. Not now, I'm not. That conversation can definitely wait. He's getting released tomorrow, you know? That's great, Dean, Sam replied happily. But where's he going to stay? The apartment is still a crime scene, right? Yeah, it is. Forensics are still going through everything. Now that they've got an actual warrant, they're being super thorough. Kaz is staying at my place for now, Dean stated to his brother. Is that best idea? Sam asked gently. He knew how his brother jumped into relationships, and he didn't want to see either of them get hurt. Yeah, it is, Sammy. He has nowhere to go. My apartment is pretty big considering it's so close to downtown and, well, I repeat, he has nowhere else to go, Dean said, sadness tinging his voice. And I'm happy to put him up. Anyway, enough of this. Let's go see how the patient is doing. The next day was a hell of a big one for both Dean and Castiel. First, they had to check out of the hospital, which was always going to take forever, considering the amount of paperwork Kaz had to sign with an arm in a sling. Then they stopped by the hospital's chemist with the prescription the doctor had given Kaz. When the painkillers had all been rung up on the till, Kaz almost fainted at the exorbitant amount of money he'd have to pay for them. First of all, he didn't have anywhere near that much cash in his wallet, and secondly, he knew for a fact that Alistair hadn't paid him for his work at the diner in months, so his savings account was zeroed out. He was just about to turn to Dean and tell him that he'd be fine without it, when Dean handed over a credit card to the clerk. Dean, you don't have to pay for them. I can. Kaz trailed off as he realized he didn't have any other options. It's fine, Kaz. What did I promise you again? Dean said softly back to him with a smile, as the cashier put the sale though. That I would never hurt you. And restricting your access to painkillers is practically hurting you myself. So, here you go. He finished passing Kaz the brown paper bag. Thank you, Kaz breathed in reply. At first he had been very unsure of the detective. Dean had seemed too forceful in finding out information about him and about Alistair, but the man was surprising him at every turn. Whilst Alistair had repeatedly promised never to hurt him, the promise had always come with conditions. He'd never hurt Kaz if he was good that day. He wouldn't beat him if Kaz didn't talk back to him. Or sometimes, he wouldn't whip Kaz with his belt if Kaz submitted to his will and his wants and desires every night. But Dean was different. Dean reminded him of Balthazar. He only wanted the best for him. He wanted him to feel safe, protected, maybe even loved. But he was also different to Balthazar in a way that was important to Castiel. He remembered how angry Balthazar had been when Kaz had told him he was dropping out of college. Balthazar had called him many things that night, and had later left voicemails on his phone, apologizing profusely for what he'd said. But Kaz had refused to take him back. He could only stand so much verbal abuse from the person he loved. Dean was different. He accepted him. Dean accepted and respected the choices he made. Dean could have found a way to arrest Alistair as soon as he'd confirmed with Kaz that the bruises on his face were the older man's doing, but he didn't. He waited until Kaz had asked for help. He respected Kaz, and Castiel didn't think he'd ever met someone, except for maybe Anna and his brother Gabriel, who really truly respected him. Kaz's silent contemplation was broken when they reached Dean's car, a shiny black 1967 Chevrolet Impala, or so Dean had told him. It was a little tricky for him to get into the car slowly and gently, but he managed, hiding the wince when his still tender back rested against the black vinyl seatback. Dean got into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition, the big car's engine turning over and rumbling. Dean smiled at the sound, and Castiel realized he liked seeing Dean happy. He would find a way, somehow, to repay him for every bit of kindness the detective had shown him recently. Dean drove much more sedately than he usually would through the streets of Lawrence. He didn't want any abrupt stop or swerving corner to aggravate Kaz's wounds in any way. Finally, he pulled up in front of the diner and cut the engine. "Do you want to come in? I can get your stuff by myself if you tell me where to look," Dean offered. But Castiel was already reaching for the door handle awkwardly with his left arm, his right arm currently encased in a cast from wrist to elbow, and then in a sling. "It's all right, I've got it. I'll need your help though, if that's all right." "You don't even have to ask Kaz," Dean said, and was out of the car and helping the battered man to the front door in seconds. Kaz pulled out his keys and unlocked the diner's front door. They walked through the dark, empty restaurant to the door at the rear, which was still hanging off its hinges, thanks to Dean. The stairs were slow going, but when they finally reached the top, Kaz stopped and turned away from the sight. Dean wrapped him in a hug. He knew what was going through Kaz's mind. The walls and floor were still stained with Kaz's blood. The forensics guys hadn't cleaned anything up yet, even though the crime scene photographer was well and truly finished with the place. "It's okay, Kaz, I've got you," Dean murmured, raising a hand to stroke Castiel's dark unruly hair. "It's okay," he repeated when he felt a tremor go through the smaller man. After a few moments, Kaz pulled away. His eyes were glassy and slightly red, but there was a look of determination on his face instead of fear. They were quick in the apartment but methodical. Dean had already cleared it with his supervisors, so Kaz could pretty much take whatever he wanted back to Dean's. He showed Dean where he kept his suitcase, and Dean laid it open on the bed, before Castiel filled it with all of the clothes he owned, which, as Dean noticed sadly, didn't amount to much. The suitcase was only half full when Kaz was finished, and Dean looked at him questionably. "Is that all?" he asked disbelievingly. "Yeah, I sold a lot of things to make ends meet until I got the job at the diner 4 years ago. Then, after I met Alistair a year later and we got together, he didn't want me buying a lot of clothes. He said the ones I had were fine," Kaz replied simply. After packing his small amount of clothes, Kaz brought his toiletries out of the bathroom and packed those, then pulled out a stack of books, mostly novels, but a couple of non-fiction ones too, and placed them in the suitcase as well. Then he asked Dean to reach down a shoebox from the top of his wardrobe. Inside were his most prized possessions: photographs of Kaz with friends in happier times, a trophy for a high school soccer game, and, ironically, a gun. "Kaz, why do you have a gun?" Dean asked, checking out the piece, weighing it in his hands. "It was a gift from Balthazar. We broke up because I needed to work full-time at the diner instead of part-time, and dropped out of college. He gave me the gun when I got the job, just in case I was ever robbed. Beauty don't like guns, and, surprisingly enough, I don't like violence, so I kept it in there," Kaz explained. "Guess it could have come in handy." "Huh, yeah, I suppose it would have," Dean agreed. "Do you know how to use it?" I do, I just don't want to have to use, Kaz said. With that he fit the shoebox into the suitcase and zipped it closed. That's everything. That's everything you have? Kaz took one last look around the bedroom. He had always hated this room the most and nodded. Yeah, that's it. Alright, let's go then, Dean said, happy to be getting out of this place. He could see it was wearing Kaz down with each passing minute. As soon as they stepped over the threshold and out into the wintry sunshine, it felt as if a huge weight had lifted from Kaz's shoulders. But almost as soon as it had dissipated, another one took his place. He waited until Dean had deposited his suitcase in the trunk and had settled himself back down in the driver's seat. Dean, where will I be staying now? He asked. The detective suddenly realized he hadn't even told Castile his ideas. Oh damn, Kaz, sorry, I meant to tell you. I was going to put you up. Is that alright? Dean, you've already done that once. I really don't want to be a hassle, Castile said, turning to look Dean in the eye. Blue meeting green. You know I will. I can't pay board or anything. Alistair hadn't paid me for weeks before any of this happened. You said you used to cook on Anna's days off, right? Dean said, remembering a conversation he, Castile and Anna had while Kaz was still laid up in hospital a week ago. Kaz nodded yes. Well, why don't you just cook a meal every now and again? I could do that, Dean. In fact, if I wrote you a shopping list, I could make something tonight, do you? No, Kaz. Tonight you're resting. And tomorrow and the next day. At least until the end of the week, Dean said, starting the car and pulling out onto the road. But, no buts, Kaz. You need to heal, Dean said, firmly but kindly. I don't know what Alistair's been telling you these last 3 years, is it? Kaz mumbled. Yes. Dean continued, but from now on, you're under my care. And you will rest and heal. And have a grand old time on the couch watching bad daytime TV, alright? Kaz couldn't help it. He smiled at that. Dean glanced at him and noticed the smile, and he subconsciously mirrored it. He drove around to the rear of the apartment block and parked in the car park behind it. The two of them caught the elevator up to Dean's floor and entered Dean's apartment to find Sam and Jess there. Dean took the suitcase full of Kaz's belongings into the bedroom while Kaz said hello. Oh, hey guys, didn't know you'd be home so early. Me and Jess were just putting together a few things for the prosecutor, Sam said, nonchalantly. He realized his mistake as soon as he saw the blood drain from Castile's face. Dean walked back out to see a shocked Kaz and a confused Sam. Kaz, you alright? Dean asked softly. Castile turned to him, and Dean could see the blatant fear present in his cobalt blue eyes. What did you say to him? He questioned his brother. Nothing. I just said that we were helping out. The Sam drifted off as he realized what he'd done to set Kaz off. The prosecutor. Crap, Kaz, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought it up. Dean interrupted Sam's apology by taking Kaz's hand and leading him into the bedroom. They sat down on the edge of the bed, and Dean could see Kaz's shoulders shaking. Hear his 2 fast breaths. Kaz, you want to tell me why you're so scared all of a sudden? He asked, making sure to keep his voice calm and neutral. Yeah, you're going to press charges. Kaz stammered. He looked up at Dean, fearful eyes wide. We have to. Kaz, I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I just didn't want to have to put you through this right now, when you've only just left hospital, Dean said, running a hand through his dark blonde hair. I didn't think Sam and Jess would still be here when we got back. What do you mean, you have to? Well, when I saved you from that asshole, I did so, without a warrant, Dean explained. Now, Sam has found a loophole in the local law that makes that okay, as long as you press charges and you. I what? You testify, Dean said resignedly. I have to testify? Kaz asked, his voice shaking. Against him? Dean nodded reluctantly, his face a perfectly readable visage of unhappiness. In the 3 years that I had to live with that man, I never once stood up to him. All of the things he did to me, the things he made me do, the pain and punishments he exacted, I never once said no, or complained, or defended myself. And now you want me to testify against him, in court? I'm sorry, Kaz, it's the only way, otherwise he walks, Dean replied, seeing the almost imperceptible flinch those last 2 words caused the other man. I don't know if I can, Kaz said, his gaze falling to the floor again. Not only was his ex-boyfriend in custody, but now he was potentially going to fail the man he was staying with. Could his life get any more complicated? It's alright if you can't, well, I don't know, figure something out. But it's a while off, alright? So how about we kick out Sam and Jess, have some dinner and get some rest? Does that sound good to you? Dean offered, his fingers finding Kaz and intertwining, a gentle squeeze telling the other man that he was here for him. That sounds good, Dean. Kaz nodded, finding the courage to smile at the detective, while inside his stomach was tying itself in knots. He didn't know if he had the strength to even see Alistair in the flesh again. let alone testify against him. But if he didn't, what would Dean do? Would he find himself without a home again? He sighed and followed Dean back into the living room of the apartment, decided that he'd just have to wait and see. Castiel's first week out of hospital was the most relaxing week he'd had in years. Dean had given up his bed for Kaz, despite Kaz's protests, and allowed him to sleep in late every morning. When Kaz woke up, a hot breakfast awaited him in the living room, where Dean's small dining table was set up in a nook with a huge window next to it, looking out onto the wintry streetscape. Then Dean would check Kaz's injuries, making sure to be as gentle as possible, rebinding the ones that still needed bandages. Sam and Jess would come over, they'd share a pot of coffee, and have a light lunch of sandwiches or salad. Afterwards, Sam and Dean would talk privately in Dean's bedroom, while Jess and Kaz caught up on the couch, before having dinner. Castiel liked Jessica. She was sweet and kind, and didn't pity him or try to sympathize with something she had no experience with. She simply asked how he was and was generally more interested in his medical prognosis. He politely chatted to her during that first week, but what he really wanted to know was what Dean and Sam were talking about in private. Finally, on Sunday night of that week, he summoned up the courage to ask Dean. The policeman was currently making dinner for them, some kind of pasta. Alistair had never cooked for Kaz. He always assumed that Kaz ate breakfast after he left for work, and had dinner before he got home, which was generally true. Even on weekends, Kaz hardly ever saw Alistair until nighttime, with the lawyer off meeting with his legal friends, or doing something else that he didn't invite Kaz to. "What are you making?" he asked, peering over Dean's shoulder at the sauce bubbling away on the stovetop. "Spaghetti bolognese," Dean announced with a smile as he saw Castiel cock his head to one side, curious. "What is it?" "I've never had spaghetti bolognese cooked from scratch for me before," Castiel replied. The last 3 words only just whispered. "Well, I suppose this is a pretty special night, then? Huh?" Dean said, his fingers finding Kaz as he stirred the sauce. They stood there for a couple minutes until Dean squeezed Kaz's hand and let it go to start cooking the pasta. Kaz left Dean's side to set the dining table for dinner with knives, forks, and cloth napkins that he found in a drawer at one end of the table. Then on the spur of the moment, he picked up the 2 tall white candles that Dean had for some reason on top of a low bookcase, and placed them on the table too. He rifled through the other drawer inside the dining table and found spare candles, and, what he was really looking for, a lighter, and lit the ones he'd placed on the table. Then he found the dimmer switch for the living dining room, and turned down the light slightly. Dean noticed the light dimming behind him and turned around, looking into the living room. He immediately caught sight of the nicely made-up table and smiled. "Oh, Kaz, you didn't have to do that," he admonished lightly, with an appreciative smile on his face. "It was worth it," Kaz said, "to see you smile." Dean gave the pasta and sauce a quick once-over, before walking into the now soft lighting of the dining nook, and right up to Kaz. He noticed Kaz stiffened slightly, but he raised his hands up to the other man's upper arms, and stroked his tanned skin gently, feeling Castiel relax beneath his fingers. "Thank you, Kaz," Dean whispered to him. "For what?" Castiel asked, a little confused. Without warning, Dean leaned in and kissed him on the mouth. At first, Kaz was surprised and recoiled just a little, but a split second later he returned the kiss. Dean pulled away and ran his thumb across Kaz's bottom lip. "For that," he smiled. 15 minutes later, and the two of them were sitting down to dinner at the dining table. Dean had pulled out a bottle of red wine, and, even though Kaz wasn't much of a drinker, he had to admit that it was delicious and suited the meal perfectly. After taking his first bite, Kaz smiled happily. "Dean, it's amazing," he said in awe. "I'm glad you like it," Dean replied, smiling back. Silence took over for a few moments as they tucked into their food, but Kaz finally broke it with the question he'd been wanting to ask all week. "What do you and Sam talk about when you go into your room?" Dean wasn't sure if she'd say. The last time anyone had mentioned it, Kaz had gone white as a ghost. But he shouldn't keep things from the man, Dean decided, especially if he wanted Kaz to trust him. "We've been talking about the trial." "Oh," Castiel replied, his eyes lowering. "Hey, Kaz, there's nothing to be afraid of, I promise you," Dean said, reaching out a hand to gently lift Castiel's face back up. "That's easy for you to say," Kaz said, refusing to look at the other man. Dean dropped his hand and sighed. "I guess I'd better tell you then," he said. "Tell me what?" Kaz asked, hesitantly, wary of speaking rudely to the other man. "When I first started at the police academy, I was straight out of school, 19 years old. I started with a bunch of other guys, and one of them was just amazing. Michael, his name was. He would get the top score on every written test, could run faster in track, shoot better, and take down another man quicker. We all looked up to him, and he chose me to be his friend. I was astonished and flattered, but I was also really careful not to frustrate him or annoy him. His father was high up in the force here in Lawrence, and I didn't want any bad gossip heading his way. After we finished at the academy, we both started as rookies here downtown, and that's when Michael first asked me if I wanted to take our relationship to the next step. At that, Dean ran a hand over his face. Reliving these memories were always tough, no matter how many times he'd told the story. When we first started going out properly, he was the sweetest, nicest guy. Exactly like he'd been when we'd been just friends, except even better. Then one day we were out on the beat just patrolling, making sure the streets were safe at night. A radio call came in. There was a robbery in progress 1 street away from us. Immediately we ran there, and since he was feeling a little under the weather that night, I got there first. The guy shot at me and I shot at him, but he didn't dodge my bullet. Once backup arrived, Michael pulled me aside. He was so angry, angrier than I'd ever seen him before. He was angry because I hadn't waited for him, or so he told me. Angry because he was worried I'd get hurt. I tried reasoning with him, and that's the first time he hit me. I was shocked, but he immediately apologized, promised he'd never hurt me again. But he did, often, and it got worse and worse. I was walking into the station saying the bruises on my face were from when a criminal had resisted arrest, or limping into the station, saying I'd fallen down the stairs. Finally, 1 year after he'd started abusing me, Sam had visited for the holidays and witnessed Michael giving me a dressing down over something completely insignificant. He saw Michael backhand me in the face a couple times. Saw his big brother just standing there taking the abuse. He talked to me later, and I realized I had to do something about it. I pressed charges, testified at his trial, and it's been 8 years since then. He only went to jail for about 2 years, but I didn't really keep tabs on him. All I'm saying is, I know it sounds like it's the most impossible thing in the world to do, but trust me, it's not, Dean said. He reached over the table and collected Castiel's hands in his own. And you'll have me beside you. That's another thing I'll promise you. Thank you, Dean, Kaz said, but his voice was shaky. Dean didn't know half of the abuse he'd gone through. Would he have to tell the court everything? He tried to push those thoughts out of his mind and concentrate on the home-cooked meal in front of him, but suddenly his appetite was gone. He looked back up to the detective. I'm scared. I know, and you have every right in the world to be, Dean said softly. But you also have every right to justice for what he's done to you. Do you want to tell me about some of it? Get it off your chest? Castiel thought about it for a moment, and then looked up at Dean, kind green eyes meeting trepidation-filled blue ones. Then he nodded. Yes. The two men finished their dinner and, after Dean told Kaz to sit down and stop helping him clear the table, they moved to the living room couch, where Kaz would be more comfortable. His injuries were slowly healing, but they were still hurting him immensely. His ribs ached with every breath, and he didn't know how he'd be able to withstand the pain emanating from them without the painkillers Dean had bought him. His broken collarbone and arm sent hot twinges through his nerves whenever something so much as brushed them, and the mending welts on his back still made him wince when a usually normal movement tugged on stitches or used muscles buried beneath still darkly bruised skin. But despite all of that, the couch was still far more comfortable than the hard-back dining table chairs, and he couldn't help but sink contentedly into his corner. Dean pressed a mug of hot coffee into his hands and sat down on the couch next to him. Kaz took a sip of coffee and looked up at Dean. Where should I start? He asked tentatively. How did you meet Alistair? Dean questioned kindly. Okay, he got the job at the diner about 4 years ago. It was to help pay my way through college, but it got too tricky making it to all of classes and working enough to support myself. So I dropped out of college pretty quickly and started working there full-time. The guy who owned the building, both the diner and the upstairs apartment, had been looking for someone to sell it to for ages. About a year after I started working there full-time, Alistair comes in to check out the place with his, I don't know, real estate advisor or something. Anyway, the real estate guy is telling him the place is a dump. It's small, dark, the apartment upstairs isn't very big, the diner has its regular crowd, but isn't a very popular place, and that it wouldn't be the best start for his investment portfolio. And then Alistair sees me. He started talking to me, asking me questions about the diner, about the apartment, figures out I work downstairs and I live upstairs. As soon as he'd found that out, he turned to his real estate advisor and told him he wanted to buy the place. The papers were pretty much signed then and there, and suddenly I was paying rent to Alistair instead of the old owner, Kaz explained. Wow, so just like that, Huh? Dean asked, trying to comprehend the situation Castiel had found himself in. It really had been somewhat of a sudden one, he conceded mentally. Just like that, Kaz echoed, taking another sip of the warm black coffee. He hoped he hadn't sounded too much like a helpless victim. He knew he had always been fairly weak, not necessarily weak of character, but weak in the sense that he never wanted to cause conflict. He would rather let someone walk all over him than have a full-on, drag-out fight with them. A fight which he knew he would lose. And people just took advantage of that. Alistair had, Balthazar had to a small degree, and his father most definitely had. At that, Kaz stopped himself mid-thought. He'd talked to Dean about Alistair, but he was most definitely not even going to think about his father. He realized that Dean had been saying his name and looked up. Sorry, I just drifted off for a moment, he apologized, eyes immediately refocusing on the floor. Hey, that's all right, Kaz, Dean said, leaning over and placing 2 fingers gently under his chin, and raising his head back up. It's not as if you're not allowed to do that. Kaz nodded. He didn't really know what to say. He was in a confusing predicament. His whole life he'd been given rules and been punished for breaking them or disobeying. And now Dean was tearing up the rulebook, giving him free will. He honestly didn't know what to do with it. So instead he just remained quiet, and took another swallow of coffee. When did you and Alistair start dating? Dean asked, softly. When Castiel paused, he quickly added, you don't have to tell me if you don't want to, Kaz. No, it's all right. I was just remembering about a month after he bought the building. I'd closed up for the night and went upstairs. I remember all I wanted to do was just have a nice long shower. And while I was in the shower, Alistair let himself into the apartment and sat himself down at the dining table with Chinese takeout. When I walked out of the bathroom, luckily I had a towel wrapped around me. I got the shock of my life. He was just sitting there waiting for me, with dinner. I didn't really know what to do. I couldn't very well ask him to leave. He was my landlord, and he'd brought me dinner. But at the same time, even back then, he scared me a little. He was just so sure of himself, so confident, like everything he attempted, he always succeeded at. He didn't know what failure or rejection was because he'd never experienced it. So I just quickly got dressed and had dinner with him. It became a regular thing. He'd come over once a week, then twice, then suddenly he was coming over every night and making his intentions known. And then he started staying over. He just, you don't know, made it happen. Made the relationship happen. I mean, the last thing I wanted was to get into a new relationship. I'd only just broken up with Balthazar, and that had been a bad breakup. But he just wouldn't let me say no. Dean nodded. Michael had been like that. Just such an imposing figure. Impossible to tell them no, or to ask them to give you some time or space. When was the first time he hurt you? Castiel swallowed, visibly shaken from the question, and Dean felt guilty asking it. But he'd have to talk about these things at the trial, if he wanted to see Alistair brought to justice, and if he couldn't talk to Dean about them, it'd be impossible for him to tell a courtroom. Dean had gone through the same thing with his brother asking him questions about Michael's abuse. He knew how hard it was. He also knew how free Castiel would feel once he got it off his chest. It was a couple months into our relationship, I suppose. He hadn't hit me or anything yet, but he'd certainly shouted at me a few times, gotten a little too angry over insignificant things, which made me feel a little unsure of the situation, a little uncomfortable. But he'd come over one night, and I could tell he was planning on staying the night. Wedwood had sex a few times before, so it wasn't anything new. But that night I was so tired. It had been a real busy day in the diner. There had been a car crash right on the corner. The one where the postal truck ran into the bus. Dean nodded, remembering, and Kaz continued. Anyway, the diner had been full all day with emergency people, first responders, journalists, and I was just run off my feet. All I wanted to do was fall into bed and sleep the entire next day. But Alistair wanted to have relations, Kaz said, and Dean could tell he was uncomfortable with the material. I politely told him no, I was too tired, during dinner when he made his intentions known. And when I told him again later on, he just lost it. He backhanded me so hard I fell to the floor. My mouth was bleeding from a split lip, and I was suddenly just so scared of him. He immediately told me he was sorry, that he was just so beautiful. He just wanted me every night if he could. He just cause broke off. That was always it. People were always telling him he was beautiful. His eyes were so blue. His lips were so kissable. His hair was so sexily tousled. It was his burden, his curse. If he hadn't been born like that, he wouldn't have attracted the abuse of Alistair, the jealousy of Balthazar, the violent ire of his father. I'm sorry, Kaz, Dean said, moving so that he was sitting closer to Kaz on the couch. wrapping an arm protectively around his shoulders. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." They sat like that in silence for a few minutes, but broke apart when Dean's mobile phone rang. "It's my brother," he said, before answering. Kaz could only hear Dean's half of the conversation, but it was clear Dean was not happy with what Sam was telling him. When he hung up, he turned to face Kaz, and the despair and anger in Dean's eyes sent a shiver through the smaller man. "Dean, what is it?" Kaz asked shakily. "What's wrong?" "It's trial," Dean said, unsure of whether or not he should be telling Kaz. It would break the poor man's heart, and possibly his resolve. "It's been brought forward. Alistair goes on trial in 2 weeks." "What? Why? I thought the trial wasn't mean to start for another 2 months?" Kaz asked, disbelievingly. "Alistair got his lawyers to bring it forward," Dean said. "But how can that possibly help him?" "It won't help him, it will disadvantage us. You'll still be healing from his injuries when you face him in court," Dean said. Castile processed the information, and suddenly his world seemed to be closing in on him. Tears welled in his eyes and started falling unchecked down his face. He barely registered Dean wrapping him in what was supposed to be a comforting embrace. All he could think about was how he would be seeing his abuser again in only a couple of weeks. And that thought alone chilled him to the bone. Castile paced the length of the living room, trying desperately to come to terms with what Dean had just said. 2 weeks? How could he possibly face Alistair in 2 weeks? He'd only just been released from hospital recently. His arm would still be in a sling from his broken collarbone. His broken ribs would still be tender. Some of the deeper cuts and bruises would be half-healed. He would only be half-healed. He felt hands on his shoulders and flinched away, even though deep down he knew Dean would never be the monster Alistair was. "Kaz, please, just sit down," Dean said calmly. He made sure to keep a bit of distance between himself and Kaz. He hadn't made Kaz flinch in a long time. "Kaz, stop, please." Kaz stopped his frantic pacing and looked up at Dean. His blue eyes were glassy. "Dean, I can't do this. I can't." "Come on, Kaz, just sit down a minute. Take a breath," Dean said, reaching out for the other man's hand. But Kaz jerked away from his touch. Dean's heart dropped, but his hopes were raised a little when Kaz walked stiffly to the couch and sat down right at one end. "Just take a minute to calm down, all right, Kaz?" "Calm down?" Kaz asked. The words were meant to be cutting, but they came out as desperate. "Dean, I can't do this. Not like this," he said, gesturing to his still injured body. "You can," Dean assured him. "If I could do it, you can do it." Castile turned to the policeman with a questioning look. "What do you mean?" "Well, I suppose I didn't tell you the whole story earlier about Michael," Dean sighed. "Sam saw him beating me and talked me into pressing charges. But before I did that, I thought I should try and give Michael a chance to redeem himself. I guess at the time I felt I owed him that or something ridiculous. I went back to our place. We'd been living together, but I'd been staying in a motel with Sam after our last fight, to talk to him. He was very calm and polite, offered me a drink and listened to what I had to say. I told him that I still loved him, but he needed help. It wasn't right what he'd been doing, but I was willing to stand by his side while he got the help he needed. I thought we were making progress, and to be honest, I still wasn't overly okay with pressing charges. He was basically the boss's son, and I didn't really want the whole force to know that I'd been putting up with someone like Michael for years. But then something in him snapped. He asked me if I loved him. I said yes. Then he asked why did I have to keep making him so unhappy. I didn't really know what to say to that, but Michael said the reason why he hit me was because I made him unhappy, and beating me helped to fix it. He kept trying to force this completely fucked up logic on me, but I wouldn't take it anymore. I said to him that I didn't think we could resolve this, and that's when he pulled a gun on me. "He shot you?" Kaz asked, eyes wide in shock. Dean nodded. He pulled up his t-shirt to reveal a tan-toned stomach, and pointed to an old yet angry-looking scar on his side. "The bullet went straight through. Didn't hit any major organs, but it still hurt like hell. I remember dropping to the floor and seeing his coming towards me, but I can't remember anything else. I guess I was lucky in that respect. But I wound up in hospital. I think my room was even on the same floor as yours. I forget how long I stayed there, but it was a while. Almost all of the ribs on my left side were broken. My jaw was broken. My left arm was broken. And then Sam comes in asking me what I was thinking, going over to see Michael. So we pressed charges, and seeing as Lawrence is a pretty quiet town, and this was a pretty huge case, the trial took place about 2 days after I was released from hospital. I had to testify with a cast on my arm, bandages around my ribs, but I could do it." Dean looked up at Kaz for a moment. "You went through all of that hurt and came out the other side more or less whole. And you asked for help. That's the toughest thing you have to do. This next part will feel like a piece of cake. You promise? Kaz looked up at Dean, and the policeman could still see a trace of the fear in his eyes. I can't promise that, but I promise you that I will be by your side the entire time. I will not abandon you, okay? Kaz nodded, but deep down he felt his stomach twisting in knots. Despite hearing Dean's story and seeing the similarities between their ordeals, he still wasn't sure if he'd be able to do it. The next 2 weeks passed by almost in a blur for Castiel. Sam and Jess came back to Lawrence to help Dean with Alistair's upcoming trial. Anna came round a few times so Sam could find out everything she knew about Kaz's previous relationship. Dean tried to keep Kaz calm, but the stress was wearing on him. He wasn't sleeping. He could barely eat. His eyes were dull and rimmed by dark circles. His cheeks were hollow, his face gaunt. And on Saturday, 2 days before the trial started on Monday, he passed out cold in the living room. Sam and Jess were sitting at Dean's table while Dean made lunch for everyone. Kaz had been in Dean's bedroom trying to get some sleep and had failed miserably. He pushed himself up from the bed, his body still aching from the last time he'd been face to face with Alistair. He shuffled down the hallway into the Dean's living room. The policeman turned to see him and smiled. Hey Kaz, how are you feeling? But Castiel's cobalt blue eyes were elsewhere. Sitting on top of the pile of papers on Dean's table was a black and white photograph of Alistair. It was taken the night he'd been arrested. Even in monochrome, Kaz wouldn't forget exactly how Alistair had looked that night. Kaz, you alright? Dean asked, taking a step towards him. Sam looked down to see what he was staring at and cursed, covering the photograph with a manila folder, but it was too late. Blue eyes met Dean's a split second before they rolled into the back of his head, and Kaz's knees gave way. Dean rushed forward and caught the slight man before he fell to the floor. Oh my god, Dean. I'm so sorry, Sam said, jumping up to help his brother carry Kaz to the couch. He was startled at how light the man was but didn't say anything. We had no idea he would be coming out of your room, Jess said, grabbing a blanket and laying over Kaz. It's okay guys, it's not your fault, Dean said, sighing. He looked down at the unconscious Castiel. He almost looked peaceful. He's worn himself out worrying about the trial. He's hardly eaten anything in the last few days. We're doing all we can, Jess said, looking over at the huge stack of papers and folders on the table. We've found so much dirt on Alistair. It's not funny. He's defaulted on loans, he's taken bribes. The man is dirty through and through. That's not really what I think Kaz is worried about, Sam said, choosing his words carefully. What do you mean? Dean asked. Well, he gave us as much information as he could about that night. I could tell it was hard for him to talk about it, so I didn't push him too much for information, Sam explained. He looked back at Kaz. The bruises on his face had almost completely healed, but the broken ribs and collarbone were still slowly on the mend. What if he's not completely innocent in all of this? What the hell are you saying, Sam? Dean said. He was angry, but kept his voice low, so as not to disturb Kaz. The man probably wouldn't wake up for a little while, but he'd had such trouble sleeping that it was about time he got some shut-eye, even if he was passed out instead of asleep. Well, I'm not saying Kaz is a bad guy, and I'm not saying Alistair is a good guy. I most definitely believe that Alistair used Castiel as a punching bag for the last couple years. But what if Kaz has a less than respectable past? Sam suggested softly. What does that have to do with anything? Dean asked. It's going to be brought up in court, Sam said, resignedly. That's what Alistair is paying his lawyer friends for. They'll be digging up any dirt they can find on him to make his story less credible. It's just bullshit, Dean finished unspectacularly. That's lawyers, Jess shrugged. Let's wait until he comes around, then we can think about asking him, Dean said, sternly. Poor Kaz had been through so much in the last couple months. That fateful morning when Dean intervened in the diner seemed at once so long ago, and, like it was yesterday. Dean sent one last concerned look to Kaz before sitting down at the table to go through everything Sam and Jess had compiled. Finally, at around 8 o'clock that night, Kaz regained consciousness. He groaned softly as a dull ache behind his eyes woke him up. Dean was by his side in seconds with a glass of water. How you feeling? Dean asked softly. Kaz slowly swung his legs around. So he was sitting on the couch and rested his elbows on his knees. He gratefully took the cool glass of water that was pressed into his hands and held it to his temple. A little better, thank you, he replied, his voice a little hoarse. We were worried for a little while, but Jess checked your vitals, said it was just your body's way of dealing with exhaustion, Dean explained. I do ironically feel rested, Kaz said. He took a sip of water and set the glass back down on the coffee table. I know now is probably not the best time, but I have to ask you something. Sam said. He pulled one of Dean's armchairs over to the couch and sat down on it. Kaz nodded in response. You've told us everything you could about your relationship with Alistair, and how his abuse escalated over the years, and we're so thankful you could find the strength to do that. Dean watched a shiver go through Kaz, but the man nodded again in response to Sam's statement. But we need to know about your past, Sam finished. Kaz looked up and Dean noticed, not for the first time in the last 2 weeks, that same look of pure fear present in his bright blue eyes. I've already told you, he said weakly. You've told us about your past with Alistair, but we need to go back further, Sam said gently. You need to know about Balthazar? He asked, confused. He looked to Dean for help, support, anything, but Dean's gaze was trained firmly on the carpeted floor. He turned back to Sam to see Dean's younger brother shaking his head. No. Then what? We need to know if there is anything at all in your past that could be used against you in the trial. We need to be ready for it. Like what? Anything that could be considered unsavory, Sam said. We've already found truckloads of dirt on Alistair that show many sides of his character, all of them negative. We need to demonstrate to the jury that this guy is bad inside and out, and has been for a long time. And we've gone through years of paperwork on him. We need to know if they will find anything on you. Deanie, don't have to go through everything, do I? The policeman looked up to see Castiel's glassy blue eyes full of unshed tears, and, hating himself for it, he put on his sternest expression, the kind reserved for uncooperative detainees, and nodded. You do? I'm sorry, Kaz. We need to know. We can't afford to be surprised in court. Please say can't do that. You have to, Kaz, Dean pressed. Please. There's no other way around it. Castiel took a deep, shaky breath, and, as tears started rolling silently down his face, he told them about his father who would beat him almost every other day for the most minuscule of infractions. Told them that the only reason he was allowed to finish high school was so Child Protection Services wouldn't take him away from his father and press charges on the man for abuse. He told them about how for a year he worked as a hustler in the next town over, trying desperately to collect the funds he needed for a college degree he would eventually drop out of after running out of money. He told them about how his whole life he had only ever tried to make ends meet, but was met with violence from the very people who should have shown him kindness. When he finally finished, Kaz felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but when he finally raised his eyes from the floor to meet Dean's, the policeman looked away. The weight returned tenfold when Kaz realized that this man, whom he'd come to think of as his savior and, possibly, someone who could actually love him for who he was, might never look at him the same way again. Who was he to think that someone as good and respectable as Dean could ever put up with someone who had failed in almost every conceivable way? Kaz put his head in his hands as the tears kept coming. Sobs racked his lean body, and his still healing broken ribs and collarbone cried out in agony. He barely noticed when the couch dipped next to him. He flinched slightly when an arm wrapped protectively around him. He'd been so lost in the past, he'd expected a punch, a kick, the sting of a leather belt, but this touch was soft and comforting. He raised his head to see Dean sitting next to him. If it is the last thing in this world that I ever do, I will make sure no one ever hurts you again, he whispered. That I promise you. You have not deserved any of the pain that has been inflicted on you. And if I can, I will find these people, and I will make them atone for what they've done to you. All Castiel could do was nod in return. He was too emotionally exhausted for words. But, once again, that weight came off his shoulders as quickly as it had settled there. The next few weeks would be like reliving the hell he had experienced in the last few years. But if he had Dean next to him, Kaz was starting to think that he could actually survive it. Monday dawned cold and gray. It was late winter, and the air was still icy when Dean and Castiel left Dean's apartment building early that morning. They would be meeting Sam and Jess at the courthouse before the trial began at 10 a.m. Both Dean and Kaz were dressed in suits, but while Dean's black one showed off his muscular figure, Kaz's old navy suit was too big on him. He still had to keep his arm in a sling to prevent any damage to his collarbone, and his movements were still stiff from his injured ribs. They walked slowly down Lawrence's main street, crossing the road, so they didn't walk past the shuttered windows of the diner Kaz had worked at. They stopped on the way and grabbed 2 takeaway coffees before arriving at the courthouse, which was 2 doors down from the police station. The 2 men stayed silent the entire way. Kaz didn't trust his voice to remain steady, and Dean didn't trust his words to keep his charge calm. They met Sam and Jess outside the courthouse, Dean's brother wearing a stern dark gray suit, and Jess in a sensible black dress. You ready, Kaz? Sam asked tentatively. His first instinct was to rest a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder, but his brain told him not to. Castiel nodded, not speaking a sound. "You're ready to testify?" Jess asked. Kaz nodded again. Another hurdle wrangled by Alistair and his lawyer cronies. Kaz would have to testify first. That was brought to their attention the previous day, and had almost given Kaz a mental breakdown again. But Dean helped him through it. Like he'd help him through this ordeal. "I'll go easy on you, but you need to be able to tell the judge and jury exactly what that man did to you," Sam had said the day before. "You'll have to give details." "I can do it, Sam," Castiel had said. His words were firm, but his voice was shaky. The clock tower's bell across town started chiming, and the group walked inside. The courtroom was almost completely empty. The entire case had been kept quiet. Alistair had wanted to alert the local newspaper, but Judge Murray and the DA hadn't allowed it for the safety and sanity of Castiel. Sam, Dean, Kaz and Jess sat down at the very front of the room behind a long desk. The bailiff walked in with Alistair, and Dean felt Kaz flinch beside him. The door behind them slammed open, making Castiel jump again, and in filed 3 men and 1 woman wearing black suits, Alistair's lawyers. Next came the 12 jurors, 6 men and 6 women. The whole courtroom stood for Judge Murray's entrance, and the trial was officially started. "Castiel Novak, please take the witness stand," Judge Murray intoned in his deep, gravelly voice. Kaz took a deep breath, and shakily got to his feet and walked to the witness box, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Sam stood up to start his examination. They went through mundane topics to begin with. When Castiel had first started working in the diner, when he'd first met Alistair, the first time Alistair had surprised him with dinner. Kaz was doing well until Sam's line of questioning came to that almost fatal night. "How did the conversation between you and the accused start?" Sam asked. Castiel stopped and took a breath. They had reached the part he was dreading to talk about. "He had asked me about the policeman, Dean, when he got home. I was cleaning up the diner and it was the first thing he said when he walked in. Had I seen that policeman again?" "You're talking about Dean Winchester?" Sam gestured behind him to his brother, and Castiel nodded. "Yes, Dean Winchester. I told him that I had seen Dean lately. I told him that Dean had told me a few things that had made me think about our relationship. He made some joke about how he didn't know I was capable of thinking, some mean joke about my intellect, and I got angry. I said he couldn't say those things to me, it wasn't right. Then I said he shouldn't hit me either. He asked me if Dean had told me that and too said yes. Then he hit me, backhanded me across my face. I fell to the ground and he kicked me in the ribs. He started screaming at me. I forget exactly what he was saying, but he kept intimating that Dean and I had started having an affair." Kaz continued. "Had you?" Sam asked. "No, not at all. Nothing had happened between us at that point. We had only ever talked." "Then what did the accused do?" "He grabbed the front of my shirt and threw me towards the door that leads up to the apartment while he pulled out his keys. I remember thinking that I'd probably already broken a few ribs, judging from the pain that I could feel here," Kaz said, gesturing to his midsection. "He unlocked the door and grabbed my shirt again, and started dragging me up the stairs. That's when Anna came into the diner. She had left something there and came back to retrieve it, I guess. She called the police." "What did Alistair do to you then?" "Hugh kicked me around a bit more. Then he tore off what remained of my shirt. Castiel's mouth went dry, and he swallowed thickly before continuing. He pulled out his belt and started lashing my back with it. I don't really remember much else, to be honest, after that point. I remember the pain on my back, and I remember finding it almost impossible to breathe, but then it all goes black." "Thank you, Mr. Novak. The witness is yours," Sam said to Alistair's lawyers. The woman in the dark suit stood up. Her face seemed pretty, but her eyes were so hard and unforgiving her stare made Kaz shrink back involuntarily in his seat. "Mr. Novak, I'm Meg Masters. I'd like to ask you a few questions. Starting with Naomi. Naomi White. You might remember her. You worked for her for about a year saving up money for college. Would you like to tell us what line of work that was?" Meg held up a photograph of a brunette woman with a stern face, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. "It was his pimp from years ago when he'd had to sell himself on a corner to make enough money to survive." Castiel's heart dropped and his mouth went dry. He felt like he was going to be sick. They were going to start with this. Dean's jaw dropped when he heard that bitch lawyer say that name. He couldn't believe it. Sam immediately stood up with an objection, but the judge allowed the defense to continue, and Dean's brother had to sit back down, fuming. The short-haired blonde lawyer placed the photograph down on the witness stand in front of Kaz, and the man cringed back from it. "What line of work was that, Mr. Novak?" Meg asked again. Kaz looked down at the picture, his stomach churning, then back up, unfortunately straight into the cold, hard gaze of Alistair. He tore his eyes away from the man and looked up at the female lawyer. What did you ask? You worked for Naomi White for a time. I'd like you to tell the courtroom what line of work you performed for her, Meg said, unable to keep a knowing half-smile from her face. Castiel looked up to the judge. Do I have to answer that? The judge nodded silently. I at wasi sold myself, he finally stammered out, his eyes downcast. There was a flurry of whispers from the jurors and from Alistair's lawyers. And what did you have to do in that role? Meg asked. I had to service her customers. And they were mostly men, yes? Castiel nodded. I'm sorry, you'll need to say that out loud for the record, Meg pushed. Yes, Cause all but whispered. So you would say that you were well and truly comfortable with sexual acts with another man? Objection. Leading the witness, Sam said, but once again to his dismay the judge allowed it. More or less, Cause replied, his voice shaking slightly. He looked to Dean, but the policeman was deep in whispered conversation with his brother. So we're talking anal sex? Cause swallowed hard and nodded. Yes. Blowjobs? Yes. Anything else? Cause looked up at the blonde lawyer in front of him. Her eyes crinkled at the sides, and she looked almost friendly, but Cause knew what she was referring to. His mouth went dry, and he felt as if it would be impossible to form coherent sentences at that point in time. You'll need to answer that question, Mr. Novak. Did you perform any other services for Ms. White's clients? Meg asked. Yes. Can you describe those services? Ush wold some of her clients like to hurt me. If they paid extra, she would let them. Castiel finally replied. His gaze dropped to the floor. How could Dean possibly trust him after this? He hadn't told Sam or his brother about this fact, and he knew Alistair was going to exploit it. Would you be able to give a few examples so the jury knows what you mean? Cause sighed softly. There was no going back now. If they knew about Naomi, she'd be a witness for the defense. If he lied or omitted any truths, they would come back to bite him later. One man liked to slap me in the face. His friend would be rough and punch me in the stomach if I did something wrong. Another man would tie me down and hit me with his belt. Nothing as bad as. Cause trailed off as his eyes met Alistair's. The man was staring daggers at him. Clearly he'd hoped Cause would lie now, and his testimony would be proven as false when they brought Naomi in. He hadn't counted on Cause telling the truth. Nothing as bad as what, Mr. Novak? Nothing as bad as when Alistair was angry, Cause all but whispered. But I had no choice to do those things for Naomi. I didn't want to do them. But Meg was already walking away, telling the judge the defense was finished with their questions. Dean walked up to the witness stand to give Cause a hand back to their side of the courtroom. Castiel didn't look at Dean, couldn't bring himself to look his good, strong policeman in the eye after what had come to light today. He just hoped Dean still let him sleep at his place, otherwise he'd have nowhere to go tonight. They all stood up as the judge exited. Then Sam collected their papers and they left the courthouse. Cause squinted in the afternoon sunlight once they emerged onto the street. He stayed silent as they walked down Lawrence's main street towards Dean's apartment building. The brothers talked amongst themselves, mainly Sam explaining the defense's tactics. Dean unlocked the front door and they walked inside, Cause mentally thanking whoever was upstairs that Dean wasn't kicking him out onto the curb. He sat down nervously on the couch. He looked up when he heard his name. Sorry. I was just asking what you wanted for dinner, Dean said, looking in the fridge. He closed the door and turned around to face Cause. I don't mind. Whatever you want to eat, Cause said, moving his eyes back to the floor. Shit, Dean said, silently cursing himself when the word made Cause flinch. He moved closer to Cause and sat down, unable to miss the almost imperceptible shiver that went through the other man's body. You've had one of the worst days of your life, and here I am asking what you want for dinner. I should be asking you how you are, Dean said softly. Cause took a shaky breath in. Infine. Well, maybe not fine, but I guess I'm through the worst of it. You should have told us about what Naomi made you do, Dean said gently. I'm sorry, Dean, really, Cause said, keeping his eyes on the floor. If there's anything I can do to make up. No, Cause, it's not that bad, come on, Dean soothed. He placed a finger under Cause's chin and raised his head. Glassy blue eyes met Dean's. I'm not mad at you. Yarn it? Why? Alistair would be furious, Cause said, his voice shaking again. Seriously, Cause, I'm not angry at you. It would have been good for us to have known that piece of information. But I know how it makes you feel, and I can understand you not wanting to talk about it, Dean said. And besides, I'm fairly sure Alistair would have assumed you'd lie when Meg asked you that question. They're bringing Naomi in as a witness, last-minute addition, so she would have argued it if you'd lied today. You did the right thing. Okay, Cause said, nodding. Dean put his arm around Cause's shoulders and was beyond happy when the man didn't flinch or cringe away. Now, how about we get you fed? Dean suggested. After a hardly eaten dinner of eggs on toast, Castile started to clear the plates away. Dean immediately stood up and gently tugged the plates from his hands. Kaz, sit down, it's all right, I've got this, Dean said softly. Kaz nodded and sat down. So Dean didn't even trust him with dirty plates now, he thought. What next? He should have told them about Naomi. But would Dean have even believed him if he said he had no choice? Kaz groaned. He felt a headache coming on. Dean was by his side in seconds. What's wrong? Do you feel okay? He asked, sitting down on the couch next to Kaz. Dean, really, I just... What? Dean prodded gently. What is it? How can you even look at me, after what I said today, about Naomi? Kaz whispered. What do you mean? I lied to you, Kaz said. I didn't tell you about Naomi. I'm just a whore. I don't belong with someone like you. Kaz, don't say that word. You are not and will never be a whore. I promise I don't think of you that way. Dean said, unshed tears brimming in his hazel eyes. And I never will. You did what you had to. Do I have to go in again? To the courtroom? Kaz nodded. I don't know. You might have to, Dean said sadly. But come on, why don't you get into bed? It's been a long day. Castile just nodded numbly. He let Dean steer him down the hallway and onto Dean's bed, where he suddenly felt beyond tired. His eyes closed and he was practically asleep when his head hit the pillow, but it wasn't a restful sleep. He dreamed he was back in Naomi's clutches, but it was a mess of the past and the not-so-past. He was tied to the rafters, and Stephen was striking his back with his belt. The pain was at once dull and sharp when the buckle bit into his skin. Next minute, Alistair threw him to the floor when he backhanded him across the face. Stephen pulled him to his feet, and then morphed into Alistair, who backhanded him again. The cycle continued until Kaz heard someone calling his name. Kaz, wake up, please wake up. Castile's ocean blue eyes shot open, and he was immediately enveloped in Dean's arms. I'm sorry, Dean. I'm so sorry, he whimpered into Dean's shoulder as tears spilled from his eyes. It's okay, I've got you, Dean murmured in response, rubbing his back in soothing circles. I'm sorry that I'm so damaged. Worthless used goods. No, Kaz, don't ever say that. You're not worthless or damaged or used, Dean said. He pushed Kaz away from him gently, so he could look the man in the eye. How can you be so sure? Kaz asked him. Because I love you, that's how, Dean said, wrapping his arms around Kaz. And, for the first time in a very long, Castile truly felt safe and loved. Ended. Thank you for watching.